A millionaire tried to humiliate her maid at her party, but the guest's reaction was unexpected. What happened surprised everyone. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The mansion perched on the rolling hills of Beverly Hills shimmered in the mid-afternoon sunlight, its grand facade a blend of opulence and cold precision. Vivian Sinclair stood at the center of the vast marble foyer, her manicured hands resting on her hips, issuing orders with a sharpness that rivaled the clicking of her high heels against the floor. Preparations for her extravagant soirée were in full swing, with a steady hum of activity filling the space. The fragrance of fresh lilies mixed with the faint aroma of waxed wood, creating an air of artificial perfection. Vivian's voice cut through the commotion like a scalpel. No, the centerpieces must have more orchids. And the champagne. Why is it not on ice yet? This is Beverly Hills, not some cheap banquet hall. Among the flurry of staff scurrying to meet her demands, Rosa Morales moved quietly. A woman of 38 with dark, expressive eyes and an air of unshakable composure, Rosa was a steady presence in the chaos. Her uniform, pristine despite the constant work, reflected her pride in her job, though it did little to shield her from the sharp edges of Vivian's tongue. "Rosa," Vivian called, her tone dripping with condescension, "you've been dusting that same table for 5 minutes. Do try to keep up, would you?" "Yes, ma'am," Rosa replied softly, her accent carrying the warmth of her Honduran roots. She lowered her gaze, not from submission, but to shield the flicker of defiance in her eyes. Behind her calm exterior, Rosa harbored dreams that stretched far beyond the walls of this mansion, dreams she dared not speak aloud in this world of silk and crystal. Vivian turned her attention to Howard McAllister, her longtime confidant and partner in gossip. With his perfectly coiffed silver hair and tailored suit, Howard embodied the very culture of surface-level sophistication Vivian so admired. "Howard," she said, her voice lightening, "you'll love this. I have a surprise planned for tonight, a little entertainment involving our dear Rosa." Howard raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Do tell, darling." "Patience," Vivian teased, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Let's just say it'll be unforgettable." Rosa caught fragments of their conversation but dismissed them. She had more pressing matters to think about, like her daughter, Clara, who waited for her at their modest apartment on the other side of town. At 12 years old, Clara was a beacon of hope in Rosa's life, a bright child who dreamed of becoming a doctor. It was for Clara that Rosa endured the indignities of her job, saving every spare dollar to pave a path toward a better future. Vivian's life, by contrast, seemed effortless from the outside. At 45, she was the epitome of beauty and success, her image carefully curated to project perfection. But behind the glossy facade lay insecurities Vivian would never admit, not even to herself. Her 2 children, Ethan and Grace, were distant both physically and emotionally. Ethan, 17, buried himself in his studies at a prestigious boarding school, while Grace, 21, was rarely home from college, her calls to her mother perfunctory at best. As the hours ticked by, the mansion transformed into a vision of luxury, every detail meticulously designed to impress. The staff worked tirelessly, yet Rosa's presence went unnoticed by the glittering guests who began to arrive. Her role was that of an invisible cog in the grand machine of Vivian's world, a world where people were judged not by their character, but by their ability to dazzle. But tonight, the balance would shift. As Rosa arranged the last of the silverware, she caught Vivian watching her with a peculiar expression, a mix of amusement and something unspoken. Rosa dismissed it, focusing instead on finishing her tasks. She had no time for games or intrigue. By the time the first strains of music floated through the mansion, Vivian was in her element, greeting guests with air kisses and exaggerated laughter. Rosa retreated to the kitchen, her sanctuary amid the chaos. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, her thoughts drifting to Clara and the bedtime story she would miss tonight. Outside, the party reached its crescendo. The chandelier above the grand dining table cast shimmering patterns across the room, and laughter spilled from every corner. Vivian's carefully constructed image was on full display, yet she couldn't shake a growing restlessness. Despite the grandeur, something felt hollow, as if the life she had built was little more than a gilded cage. In the kitchen, Rosa was called back to the floor. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, her presence unremarkable yet indispensable. Vivian's eyes followed her as she served drinks and cleared plates, the beginnings of her plan unfolding in her mind. Howard noticed Vivian's smirk and leaned in. "Are you going to let me in on this little surprise of yours?" "Patience, Howard," Vivian whispered, her tone edged with anticipation. "It's not quite time yet." Rosa, unaware of what the evening held, continued her work, her thoughts never straying far from Clara. She carried within her a quiet dignity, a strength forged through years of sacrifice and struggle. Tonight, she would need every ounce of it. As the clock struck 10, the air in the room seemed to shift, the energy crackling with a tension Rosa couldn't place. Vivian's gaze fixed on her, a smile that didn't reach her eyes playing at her lips. Rosa braced herself, a sense of foreboding settling in her chest. Whatever was coming, she could feel it would change everything. The mansion's grand ballroom radiated with a golden glow, the light catching the intricate details of the crystal chandeliers and bouncing off the gilded frames of towering mirrors. Guests swirled around the room like a living painting, their laughter weaving through the strains of the live string quartet. Vivian Sinclair floated among them, her emerald green gown trailing elegantly behind her. She moved with purpose, her sharp eyes scanning the room for her next moment of spectacle. In the kitchen, Rosa Morales stood at the counter, meticulously arranging hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. Her hands worked with practiced precision, but her mind was restless. The sensation of being watched earlier lingered, though she dismissed it as paranoia. She had learned long ago not to dwell on the strange nuances of the Sinclair household. Tonight, she resolved, would be like any other. Hours of labor followed by the relief of stepping back into her own world when the last guest departed. Her moment of reflection was interrupted by a voice that startled her. It was Monica, one of the younger housemaids, her cheeks flushed from ferrying drinks to the guests. "Rosa, Mrs. Sinclair wants to see you." Rosa turned, her brow furrowing. "What for?" Monica shrugged. "No idea. She just said you're needed in the ballroom." Rosa wiped her hands on a cloth, unease creeping into her chest. It was unusual for Vivian to call her into the public eye during an event. With a measured breath, she followed Monica through the swinging kitchen doors and into the sea of well-dressed strangers. Her sensible shoes felt out of place on the polished floor, their muted sound swallowed by the buzz of conversation. Vivian spotted her immediately and strode over, her smile too wide to be comforting. "Ah, Rosa, there you are. Follow me, dear." Without waiting for a response, she led Rosa to a side room off the main hall. Inside, a delicate silk gown hung from a rack, its soft blush color shimmering under the warm light. Next to it lay a pair of modest heels and a small velvet box containing a simple string of pearls. Rosa's confusion deepened. "Mrs. Sinclair, what is this?" Vivian's smile didn't falter. "Tonight, I want you to join the party as a guest. Consider it an opportunity to step out of the shadows for a change." The suggestion was so out of character for Vivian that Rosa hesitated, searching her employer's face for any sign of malice. "I don't understand." "I'm here to work," Vivian waved a dismissive hand. "You'll still be working, in a sense. I think it's time we showed everyone the woman who keeps this house running so smoothly. Don't worry, I've taken care of everything. Get dressed and join us in 20 minutes. Before Rosa could object, Vivian left the room, leaving her standing alone with the gown. A knot formed in her stomach as she stared at the fabric. Something about this felt wrong, but refusing Vivian wasn't an option. With a resigned sigh, she changed quickly, the gown fitting her better than she expected. The pearls, though understated, felt like a weight around her neck. When she re-entered the ballroom, the room seemed to hush for a fleeting moment before the hum of chatter resumed. Heads turned, eyes flickering with curiosity and, in some cases, skepticism. Rosa's steps faltered, but she straightened her posture, determined not to let her discomfort show. Howard McAllister was the first to approach her, his champagne flute catching the light. "Well, look at you, Rosa. A transformation worthy of a fairy tale." She forced a polite smile. "Good evening, Mr. McAllister. Vivian has certainly outdone herself," he said, his tone tinged with amusement. "I imagine this is her way of experimenting." Rosa chose not to respond, her focus shifting to the other guests. She recognized some faces, high-profile philanthropists and CEOs who frequented Vivian's soirées, but their gazes now felt heavier, as though dissecting her presence among them. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You look beautiful," a woman said. Rosa turned to see Margaret Hewitt, a philanthropist whose reputation for warmth preceded her. Margaret's kind eyes softened the tension Rosa carried. "It's a bold move, stepping into the spotlight like this." "It wasn't exactly my choice," Rosa admitted, her voice low. "But thank you." Margaret studied her for a moment before leaning in slightly. "There's strength in standing where people don't expect you to. Don't let anyone take that from you." The words resonated with Rosa, though she wasn't sure why. As Margaret walked away, Rosa felt the weight of the pearls again, not as a burden, but as a reminder to hold her head high. Across the room, Vivian watched, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Howard sidled up to her, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "She's holding her own better than you expected, isn't she?" Vivian's expression tightened. "Let's see how long that lasts." Meanwhile, Rosa found herself drawn into conversations she hadn't anticipated. Some guests were curious, others condescending, but she answered each question with poise. As the evening wore on, a strange realization settled over her. She wasn't invisible anymore. Whether for better or worse, people saw her now, and their reactions were not what she had feared. Yet, she couldn't shake the unease. Vivian's motives remained unclear, and the flicker of amusement in her employer's eyes suggested this was only the beginning. For Rosa, the night had shifted into unfamiliar territory, and she couldn't predict where it would lead. The room buzzed with conversations that dipped and rose like ocean waves, the murmur of refined voices mingling with the faint strains of the string quartet. Rosa Morales stood near the periphery, her back straight but her mind uneasy. The weight of the silk gown and pearls, though delicate, felt oppressive as she navigated this unfamiliar world. She had never meant to draw attention, and yet tonight she found herself under the scrutiny of strangers whose eyes judged her every movement. As she accepted a flute of sparkling water from a passing waiter, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a gaze that hinted at both curiosity and disdain approached. "So, you're Rosa," the woman said, her voice crisp, each word wrapped in a veneer of politeness. "Vivian's new friend." Rosa forced a polite smile, keeping her voice measured. "I work for Mrs. Sinclair." The woman's lips curved slightly, but the smile lacked warmth. "Interesting choice of words. I'm Meredith Caldwell. My husband, Richard, has spoken highly of the Sinclair parties." This is my first one. It's a pleasure to meet you, Rosa replied, her tone steady. Meredith tilted her head, studying Rosa as if searching for a flaw in a painting. Vivian has an eye for making statements, Meredith remarked, her gaze flickering to Rosa's gown. And I must say, you're quite the unexpected centerpiece. Rosa didn't flinch. Sometimes it's the unexpected that leaves a lasting impression. The woman's brows lifted slightly, surprised by the response. Before she could retort, a voice interrupted them. Meredith, darling, there you are. Margaret Hewitt, the renowned philanthropist, approached with an ease that contrasted sharply with Meredith's taut posture. Her kind eyes landed on Rosa, and she smiled warmly. Rosa, isn't it? I was just telling my husband about you. Rosa nodded, grateful for the interruption. That's kind of you, Mrs. Hewitt. Margaret, please, she corrected. Turning to Meredith, she added, I'm sure we'll see much more of Rosa. She seems to handle herself better than most of us in these rooms. Meredith's lips tightened, but she said nothing, excusing herself with a curt nod. Margaret lingered, her gaze on Rosa softening. I hope you don't mind me saying so, but you're handling this remarkably well. Rosa hesitated before speaking. I don't think I had a choice. There's always a choice, Margaret replied, her voice calm but firm. But it's the harder ones that shape us. Rosa didn't know how to respond, but Margaret's words lingered even after she walked away. She felt the conflicting weight of their truth. Choices often felt distant when survival dictated her actions. She scanned the room for Vivian and spotted her standing with Howard McAllister, her head tilted in laughter, though her eyes darted occasionally toward Rosa. A sense of unease settled deeper into Rosa's chest. Vivian's intentions remained opaque, but her amusement suggested this was all part of a larger plan. The evening dragged on, and Rosa's discomfort grew as more guests approached her. Most were polite, their questions veiled in curiosity, though a few couldn't hide their skepticism. Where did you say you're from again? One man asked, his tone teetering on the edge of condescension. Honduras, Rosa replied, her voice steady but tired. The man hummed, as though the answer confirmed something unspoken. Through it all, Rosa clung to the words of her daughter, Clara, who that morning had whispered, Mama, you're stronger than anyone knows. Clara had a way of seeing her mother's strength, even when Rosa doubted it herself. Tonight, those words were a lifeline. As the clock struck 11, Vivian finally stepped onto a small stage at the edge of the room. The chatter dimmed, and all eyes turned toward her. She held a glass of champagne, her smile radiant, but Rosa could sense the sharpness beneath it. Good evening, everyone, Vivian began, her voice smooth as silk. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's a pleasure to host such a distinguished group of friends. Her gaze swept over the crowd before landing on Rosa. Tonight is about celebrating the unexpected. We live in a world where appearances often dictate perceptions, but every now and then someone challenges that notion. Someone like Rosa. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Rosa felt her cheeks flush as every head turned toward her. She gripped her glass tightly, willing herself to remain composed. Rosa has been with us for some time now, Vivian continued, her tone light but calculated. And I thought, why not give her a chance to step out from behind the scenes? To be part of the world she works so hard to support. The words, though flattering on the surface, felt barbed. Rosa forced a smile, nodding in acknowledgement as the crowd clapped politely. Margaret Hewitt's approving gaze offered a flicker of solace, but Rosa knew this moment was not as benign as Vivian had framed it. She glanced at Howard, whose smirk betrayed that he was in on whatever game Vivian was playing. The applause subsided, and the party resumed, but Rosa felt the shift in the air. Whispers followed her as she moved through the room, a sense of unease trailing her like a shadow. For the first time that evening, she felt not just out of place but exposed. Later, when the crowd began to thin, Vivian approached Rosa, her smile as polished as the diamonds at her neck. "You handled that well," she said, her tone almost approving. "I wasn't sure you'd rise to the occasion." Rosa met her gaze, her voice measured but firm. "I didn't realize there was an occasion to rise to Mrs. Sinclair." Vivian chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Life is full of surprises, Rosa. You should know that by now." As Vivian walked away, Rosa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Whatever Vivian's intentions, tonight had planted seeds of something Rosa couldn't yet define, seeds that would inevitably grow, whether she was ready for them or not. The morning sun poured through the mansion's tall windows, casting long beams of light across the polished floors. The echoes of last night's party had faded, leaving only the faint scent of lilies and the evidence of footsteps on the gleaming surface. Rosa Morales moved silently through the foyer, a damp cloth in hand, wiping away smudges from the marble-topped table near the staircase. Her movements were steady, methodical, but her mind raced with the memories of the previous evening. Vivian's speech, though delivered with a practiced charm, had left Rosa unsettled. She replayed the words over and over, dissecting their meaning and the lingering glances from the guests. They had clapped politely, their smiles thin and unsure, their eyes scanning her as if trying to unravel a puzzle. Rosa had felt like a specimen under a glass dome, displayed but not truly seen. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp clicking of heels. Vivian appeared at the top of the staircase, her emerald robe trailing behind her. She carried a coffee cup in one hand, her other hand holding a phone pressed to her ear. Even in the early hours, her presence filled the room with an air of command. "Howard, I'm telling you, it was a triumph," Vivian said into the phone as she descended. Her laughter floated down the staircase, light and controlled. The way they looked at her, it was priceless. Yes, I think it added a bit of flavor to the evening. Rosa stiffened but kept her gaze on her work. She knew better than to let Vivian see her reaction, though her heart hammered in her chest. Vivian ended the call as she reached the bottom step, turning her attention to Rosa. "Good morning," she said, her tone sweet but tinged with a certain satisfaction. "I trust you slept well." Rosa straightened, folding the cloth in her hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Sinclair. I did, thank you." Vivian sipped her coffee, studying Rosa with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You were quite the star last night," she said. "The guests couldn't stop talking about you." "I didn't mean to draw attention," Rosa replied, her voice calm. "I only did what you asked." Vivian tilted her head, her lips curving into a sly smile. "And you did it beautifully. Don't be so modest, Rosa. You have a presence that surprises people. It's, unexpected." Rosa said nothing, meeting Vivian's gaze with a quiet strength that made the older woman falter, if only for a moment. Vivian turned away, her voice light again. "I have another event planned for next month. Perhaps we can find a way to top this one." As Vivian disappeared down the hall, Rosa allowed herself a moment to breathe. The air seemed to shift, the weight of Vivian's scrutiny lifting. Yet the unease lingered, a gnawing feeling that something deeper was at play. Later that day, Rosa sat in the small room she called her break space, a worn chair and a modest table her only comforts. She cradled a cup of tea, its warmth grounding her as she thought of Clara. Her daughter's laughter echoed in her mind, a reminder of the life that existed beyond the mansion's walls. The door creaked open, and Monica stepped in, her face flushed from carrying linens up the stairs. "Rosa," she said, closing the door behind her, "I heard what Mrs. Sinclair said to you this morning. Are you okay?" Rosa offered a small smile, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I'm fine. Sit for a moment. You've been running around all day." Monica hesitated before plopping into the chair, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know how you stay so calm. If it were me, I'd have snapped at her by now." "That's not an option for me," Rosa said simply. "But that doesn't mean I don't feel it." Monica studied Rosa, her admiration evident. "You're stronger than anyone here gives you credit for." Rosa's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Strength isn't always about what people see, Monica. Sometimes it's about what you choose not to show." The younger woman nodded, absorbing Rosa's words. "Still, you shouldn't have to put up with it." Rosa glanced out the small window, the city's skyline visible in the distance. "I do what I have to. For Clara. She deserves every chance I can give her." Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp buzz of Rosa's phone. She picked it up, her face softening as Clara's name lit up the screen. "Mama!" came the bright voice on the other end. "Are you coming home soon?" Rosa's heart ached at the longing in her daughter's tone. "Not yet, mi amor, but I'll see you tonight. Did you finish your homework?" "Yes," Clara replied, pride lacing her words. "And I read another chapter of the book you gave me." Rosa closed her eyes, drawing strength from her daughter's resilience. "That's my girl. I'll bring you something sweet on my way home." When the call ended, Rosa sat in silence, the room suddenly feeling smaller. Clara was her anchor, the reason she endured nights like last night and mornings like today. It wasn't just for survival, it was for a future where her daughter wouldn't have to endure the same. By the time Rosa returned to her tasks, the mansion was bustling again, but her steps felt lighter, her resolve stronger. Vivian could play her games, but Rosa knew her worth wasn't defined by the judgments of the wealthy or the whispers of strangers. It lived in the laughter of her daughter and the quiet dignity she carried each day. For now, that was enough. The evening breeze swept gently across the manicured gardens of the Sinclair mansion, rustling the delicate petals of roses and the cascading vines that clung to the wrought iron trellises. Rosa Morales stood on the rear patio, her hands gripping the edge of the stone railing as she stared into the distant city lights. The noise of the day had finally quieted, but her thoughts remained restless. Rosa had spent the afternoon catching fragments of whispers among the staff, some filled with sympathy, others edged with envy. Word of Vivian's calculated display during the party had spread like wildfire. Everyone had their own theory about the reason behind it, but Rosa couldn't waste time unraveling motives. What mattered most was the subtle shift it had caused in her own world. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her reverie. She glanced at the screen and smiled faintly. It was Clara, sending a picture of the school project she'd been working on, a hand-drawn diagram of the human body, carefully labeled in neat handwriting. Rosa replied with a simple heart emoji, her chest tightening with pride. For all the trials she faced within these walls, Clara's ambitions made the struggle worthwhile. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Rosa's attention back to the present. She turned to see Ethan Sinclair, Vivian's 17-year-old son, lingering near the doorway. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his blazer, his usual air of aloofness replaced with hesitation. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Ethan said, his voice softer than Rosa expected. "You're not interrupting," Rosa replied, straightening her posture. "Did you need something?" Ethan shrugged, stepping closer. I wanted to say I'm sorry about last night. I don't know what my mom was thinking." Rosa's eyes widened slightly. It was rare for anyone in the Sinclair family to acknowledge her as more than a fixture of the house. "It's not your fault," she said cautiously, "but thank you." He leaned against the railing, his gaze drifting to the garden. "She does these things, you know, puts people in situations to see how they'll react. I think she enjoys having control over everything." Rosa regarded him quietly, the vulnerability in his tone surprising her. Ethan had always seemed detached, his interactions with the staff perfunctory. Now, he looked more like a boy searching for understanding than the heir to a fortune. "She must have her reasons," Rosa said carefully, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "But I'm not sure I'll ever understand them." Ethan chuckled dryly. "Neither do I." For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, the distant hum of traffic filling the void. Then, Ethan turned to her, his expression earnest. "You handled it well, though." "I think most people would have panicked or stormed out," Rosa shrugged, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I've had practice staying calm under pressure." Ethan nodded, as though that answer made perfect sense. "Well, if it means anything, I think you're stronger than she gives you credit for." The sincerity in his voice caught Rosa off guard, but she didn't let it show. "Thank you, Ethan. That means more than you know." As he pushed off the railing and headed back inside, Rosa found herself pondering his words. Strength wasn't something she often attributed to herself, though it was something she knew she possessed. It was woven into the fabric of her being, built through years of hardship and sacrifice. But hearing it spoken aloud stirred something unfamiliar, a faint glimmer of pride. The next morning, Rosa awoke to the sound of bustling activity. The mansion was alive with preparations for yet another event, though this one seemed smaller, more intimate. The staff hurried through the halls, their faces tense with concentration. Rosa kept her head down as she worked, polishing the silver trays that would soon carry champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Vivian appeared in the kitchen, her sharp heels clicking against the tiles. She surveyed the preparations with her usual air of authority, her presence commanding the room even without words. When her eyes landed on Rosa, she paused. "Rosa," Vivian said, her tone brisk, "come with me." Rosa followed her into the adjacent sitting room, the walls adorned with portraits of Vivian's ancestors, their stern faces frozen in oil. Vivian gestured for Rosa to sit, a rare invitation that only heightened her unease. "I've been thinking about last night," Vivian began, her voice measured. "You performed admirably under the circumstances. It's not often that people surprise me." Rosa stayed silent, unsure where this was going. "I'm planning another event soon," Vivian continued, "and I'd like you to play a more visible role, something less behind the scenes." Rosa's heart sank. She had no desire to repeat the spectacle of the previous night, but refusing Vivian was a delicate dance. "Mrs. Sinclair," she began carefully, "I appreciate your trust, but I'm not sure that's where I belong." Vivian tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You underestimate yourself, Rosa. Last night, you proved that you can handle yourself in any situation. Why not embrace the opportunity?" Rosa chose her next words carefully. "I have responsibilities outside of this house, Mrs. Sinclair. My daughter depends on me, and I need to focus on providing for her." Vivian's expression softened, but only slightly. "Of course. Clara, isn't it? Such a bright girl. I respect that you're doing everything you can for her, but don't dismiss this chance. It could open doors you never imagined." The conversation left Rosa feeling unsettled. Vivian's words were persuasive, but Rosa couldn't shake the sense that they were laced with ulterior motives. As she returned to her work, her mind churned with questions. She would have to tread carefully, balancing the demands of this new role with the life she had worked so hard to protect. That night, as Rosa sat at her kitchen table with Clara, watching her daughter's eyes light up while describing her day, she made a silent vow. No matter what the future held, she would ensure that Clara's dreams remained within reach. Her strength would be enough for both of them. The morning was crisp, the air tinged with the faint scent of dew as Rosa Morales stepped off the bus and made her way to the Sinclair mansion. She walked with a measured pace, her mind swirling with Vivian's proposition. The words lingered, tugging at her thoughts like a persistent thread. Rosa had spent years navigating a delicate balance, working tirelessly in the shadows to support Clara while keeping her head down. Vivian's offer threatened to unravel that careful equilibrium, and Rosa wasn't sure if she could afford to let it. As she reached the side entrance, she noticed a black car idling in the driveway. Its polished surface reflected the pale light of the early sun. Rosa hesitated, recognizing the vehicle. It belonged to Margaret Hewitt. The woman's presence here was unexpected, though Rosa felt a flicker of curiosity rather than alarm. Inside, the mansion was already alive with activity. Rosa exchanged polite nods with the other staff before heading to the kitchen, where the chef barked instructions to his team. Amid the flurry of movement, Margaret's calm voice carried from the adjacent sitting room, drawing Rosa's attention. "Rosa," Margaret called, her tone warm yet commanding. Startled, Rosa set down the tray she was holding and wiped her hands on her apron. She entered the sitting room to find Margaret seated gracefully on a velvet armchair, a steaming cup of tea in her hand. Vivian stood nearby, her arms crossed, watching the exchange with a faint smile. "Mrs. Hewitt," Rosa greeted, her voice even but wary. "You asked for me." "Yes, please sit," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "I wanted to have a word with you." Rosa glanced at Vivian, whose expression remained unreadable, before lowering herself into the chair. The sitting room, with its ornate decor and heavy drapes, felt imposing, but Margaret's presence softened the space. "You left quite an impression at the party," Margaret began, her eyes kind but probing. "I imagine it wasn't the evening you expected." Rosa's lips tightened slightly. "It wasn't, but I managed," Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's evident. You showed poise and dignity, qualities that many in that room sorely lacked." Vivian chuckled softly, interjecting, "She has a knack for that, doesn't she?" Margaret's gaze flicked to Vivian, her smile thinning. "Indeed. But there's more to Rosa than poise, isn't there?" Rosa's stomach twisted slightly. She felt exposed under Margaret's piercing yet empathetic scrutiny. "I do my best to carry myself with respect," she said cautiously. Margaret leaned forward, resting her elbows on the armrests. "That much is clear. But tell me, Rosa, have you ever considered what you might accomplish if you stepped out of the shadows?" The question hung in the air, its weight pressing against Rosa's chest. She met Margaret's gaze, her own steady but uncertain. "I have responsibilities," Rosa replied after a pause. "My daughter needs me to stay grounded. I can't afford to take risks." Margaret's expression softened, her voice lowering. "I understand that more than you know. But sometimes the risks we fear are the ones that lead to the most profound growth, not just for ourselves, but for those we care about." Rosa's fingers curled slightly against her lap. "And what if those risks don't pay off? What if I lose everything I've worked so hard to protect?" Margaret's eyes didn't waver. "That's a possibility, yes. But from what I've seen, Rosa, you possess a strength and resilience that most people can only dream of. Those qualities are the foundation for taking risks and succeeding." Vivian, who had remained silent during their exchange, stepped closer. "Margaret's right," she said, her tone surprisingly free of condescension. "I wouldn't have asked you to take on a more prominent role if I didn't think you could handle it." Rosa looked between the two women, their words sinking into her like drops of water on parched earth. She wasn't accustomed to being seen as more than a worker, and the sudden attention felt both validating and overwhelming. Margaret placed her tea on the side table and leaned back, her gaze unwavering. Think about it, Rosa. Your story, your journey, it's worth sharing. And not just for the benefit of others, but for yourself. You've spent so much time building a life for your daughter. Maybe it's time to build something for you too. Rosa remained silent, her thoughts tangled. Margaret's words resonated deeply, stirring a yearning she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. Yet fear still clung to her, whispering of the risks and the sacrifices she couldn't afford. Margaret stood, smoothing the folds of her tailored coat. I'll leave you with this thought. Strength isn't just about enduring. It's about choosing when to stand up and step forward. She smiled gently at Rosa before turning to Vivian. I'll see you soon, Vivian. After Margaret left, the room fell into a charged silence. Vivian watched Rosa for a moment, her expression unreadable. You have more allies than you think, she said finally. Don't let fear stop you from seeing that. As the day wore on, Margaret's words echoed in Rosa's mind, their weight growing heavier with each passing hour. That evening, as she sat at the kitchen table with Clara, helping her with a math problem, the question Margaret had posed resurfaced. What if you stepped out of the shadows? Rosa glanced at Clara, her daughter's brow furrowed in concentration as she erased a mistake. The thought both terrified and intrigued her. For years, Rosa had lived in service of others, her own aspirations buried beneath the weight of responsibility. But now, for the first time, she wondered what might happen if she allowed herself to dream again. The day began quietly, the kind of stillness that felt unusual in the Sinclair household. Rosa Morales had risen before dawn, as always, slipping out of her modest apartment while Clara was still asleep. The streets of her neighborhood were bathed in the faint glow of streetlights, and the bus ride to Beverly Hills had been uneventful. Yet, as Rosa walked the familiar path to the side entrance of the mansion, she sensed a change in the air. Inside, the house was unusually calm. The clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen was absent, replaced by the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner somewhere upstairs. Rosa found the quiet disconcerting, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She went to work immediately, dusting and tidying with the precision she had honed over years. Her body moved on autopilot, but her mind remained preoccupied with Margaret Hewitt's words from the previous day. Strength isn't just about enduring, it's about choosing when to stand up and step forward. The phrase had lingered, casting a shadow over her thoughts. Rosa had spent her life enduring, her strength defined by her ability to withstand hardship. But Margaret's suggestion that strength could also mean stepping out of her comfort zone felt both empowering and dangerous. Her musings were interrupted by a voice calling her name. Rosa turned to see Ethan Sinclair standing in the doorway, his usual air of detached coolness softened by a hint of curiosity. He wore casual clothes, jeans and a fitted t-shirt that made him seem younger, less like the heir to a vast fortune and more like an ordinary teenager. "Good morning, Ethan," Rosa greeted, her tone polite but guarded. "Morning," he replied, stepping into the room. He hesitated before continuing. "I was wondering if you had a minute." Rosa set down the cloth she had been using to polish a vase. "Of course." "What do you need?" Ethan scratched the back of his neck, a nervous habit Rosa had noticed before. "It's about last night, or, well, everything lately. I've been thinking a lot about what my mum did at the party." Rosa raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, encouraging him to continue. "I don't know why she does things like that," Ethan admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's like she enjoys testing people, seeing how far she can push them, but with you, it didn't feel right." Rosa folded her hands in front of her, meeting his gaze with calm intensity. "Your mother has her reasons, I'm sure. Whether or not they're fair, I can't say." He nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I just wanted you to know that not everyone here thinks like her. I know I've been distant, but I see how hard you work. And Clara, I've heard about her. She sounds incredible. The mention of Clara brought a genuine smile to Rosa's face. She's the reason I do everything I do. Ethan returned the smile, though his was tinged with sadness. It must be nice, having someone to fight for. I guess I don't really feel that with my mom or Grace. We're all just separate. Rosa's heart softened at his honesty. Family isn't always easy, she said gently. But it's never too late to change things. Ethan looked thoughtful, as though her words had struck a chord. Maybe, he said finally, I just hope I can figure it out before it's too late. As Ethan left, Rosa felt a surge of empathy for the boy. Beneath his polished exterior, he was grappling with the same questions she was, how to navigate a life that felt constrained by invisible boundaries. Later that afternoon, Rosa was called to the sitting room, where Vivian Sinclair waited with an expression that could only be described as predatory. She sat on the edge of a chaise lounge, her posture elegant but rigid, her fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. Rosa, Vivian began, her tone deceptively pleasant, I've decided to include you in next month's event. Rosa's stomach tightened. Mrs. Sinclair, I'm not sure that's... Vivian held up a hand, silencing her. Before you protest, let me explain. This won't be like the last time. I've arranged for a more curated experience. You'll represent the household staff, but in a way that highlights the human element of our lives. People adore that sort of thing. Rosa forced herself to maintain a neutral expression, though her mind raced. I appreciate your confidence in me, she said carefully, but my priority is my daughter. I can't let anything compromise that. Vivian's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course, Rosa. Everything I do is to support the people around me. Surely you see this could benefit you and Clara, if handled correctly. The subtle threat in her words wasn't lost on Rosa, but she held her ground. I'll think about it. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing more, dismissing Rosa with a wave of her hand. That evening, Rosa returned home to Clara, whose bright smile was a balm for her frayed nerves. They sat together at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal of rice and beans while Clara described her latest school project. As Rosa listened, she felt a renewed sense of clarity. She didn't trust Vivian's motives, but Margaret's words lingered still, offering a glimmer of hope. Rosa would think about the event, not as a favor to Vivian, but as a step towards something greater. For Clara's sake, she couldn't afford to dismiss the opportunity without considering its potential. As Clara leaned against her shoulder, humming softly, Rosa made a quiet decision. She would not let fear define her. If there was a way to secure a brighter future for her daughter, she would find it, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. The Sinclair mansion was abuzz with activity, its staff moving in a choreographed dance to ready the house for Vivian's next event. Rosa Morales worked quietly, but with heightened awareness. Every polished surface and carefully arranged bouquet felt like a step toward the inevitable. The event loomed like a storm cloud, and with it, the promise of change she couldn't yet define. Vivian had been surprisingly restrained, offering little in the way of specifics about Rosa's role in the upcoming evening. This ambiguity left Rosa uneasy, but it also gave her time to prepare herself mentally. She kept her focus on the work and on Clara, whose infectious optimism remained Rosa's greatest source of strength. As the night of the event approached, Rosa found herself standing in front of a floor-length mirror in the mansion's staff quarters. Laid out on a nearby chair was a sleek navy blue dress, modest yet elegant, its understated design a stark contrast to the opulence of the Sinclair wardrobe. Vivian had sent it down that morning, accompanied by a note. "For the event, you'll do wonderfully." Rosa regarded the dress with suspicion. It felt like armor, a costume meant to project a version of herself she wasn't sure she recognized. But as she studied her reflection, she thought of Margaret's words and the quiet encouragement she had received from Ethan. They saw something in her, something Rosa hadn't allowed herself to see in years. Taking a deep breath, she slipped into the dress and adjusted the neckline. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, but as she straightened her posture and met her own gaze, she caught a glimmer of confidence. Tonight wasn't about Vivian's game. It was about Rosa finding her footing in a world that had always seemed out of reach. The mansion came alive as the first guests arrived. Cars lined the circular driveway, their headlights cutting through the dusk as chauffeurs opened doors for impeccably dressed men and women. The chatter of laughter and clinking glasses filled the grand foyer, and Rosa, now positioned near the entrance, felt the weight of countless eyes as guests passed her. Margaret Hewitt arrived early, her sharp eyes immediately finding Rosa in the crowd. With a warm smile, she crossed the room and clasped Rosa's hands. "You look radiant," Margaret said, her voice low enough to offer privacy in the bustling space. "Remember what I told you, poise, dignity, and truth. That's all you need." Rosa nodded, grateful for the reassurance. "Thank you, I'll do my best." Margaret squeezed her hands gently before stepping aside to greet another guest. Rosa lingered near the edge of the room, her heart pounding as Vivian made her grand entrance. Dressed in a scarlet gown that shimmered under the chandelier, Vivian commanded attention effortlessly. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Rosa with a satisfied smile. "Rosa," Vivian called, her voice honeyed but firm. "Come, join me." The room quieted slightly as Rosa moved to Vivian's side. She felt the weight of the guests' stares, their curiosity palpable. Vivian placed a hand lightly on Rosa's shoulder, her touch both reassuring and possessive. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vivian began, her voice carrying easily over the hum of the room. "Tonight, we celebrate not only our shared successes, but the incredible people who make them possible. I'd like to introduce you to Rosa Morales, a woman of remarkable strength and grace, whose contributions to this household go far beyond what most of us could ever understand." The applause that followed was polite but hesitant, tinged with confusion. Rosa fought the urge to shrink under the attention, instead forcing herself to stand tall. She glanced at Margaret, who nodded subtly, her expression encouraging. "Rosa has agreed to share a few words with us tonight," Vivian continued, stepping aside. "Her story is one of resilience and hope, a reminder of what can be achieved when we support one another." Rosa's breath caught in her throat. Vivian hadn't mentioned this part. She glanced around the room, her pulse quickening, but then she saw Clara's face in her mind. Her daughter's unwavering belief in her strength was a steadying force. Stepping forward, Rosa took a moment to gather herself. The room seemed impossibly large, the faces a blur of expectation. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Thank you for welcoming me tonight," she began. "I'm not used to standing in front of a room like this, but I've learned that sometimes we have to step out of the familiar to find our strength." The room grew quieter, the murmur of conversation fading as Rosa continued. She spoke of her journey from Honduras, the challenges she faced as a single mother, and the sacrifices she made to build a better future for Clara. Her words were simple, unadorned, but they carried a raw honesty that cut through the polished veneer of the room. By the time she finished, the silence was profound. Margaret was the first to clap, her applause sparking a wave of genuine appreciation from the crowd. Even Vivian seemed caught off guard, her smile faltering briefly before she regained her composure. As the evening wore on, Rosa was approached by several guests who offered kind words and admiration. Margaret stayed close, her presence a comfort amid the unfamiliar territory. Rosa felt a strange mixture of relief and empowerment, as though she had crossed an invisible threshold. When the event finally ended and the mansion grew quiet again, Rosa sat alone in the staff quarters, the dress still clinging to her like a second skin. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, her mind racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time, Rosa allowed herself to hope. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Sinclair mansion, casting golden patterns across the polished floors. Rosa Morales moved through the house quietly, her mind still lingering on the events of the previous evening. The applause, the kind words from strangers, and Margaret's steady support had all left an impression, yet beneath her newfound sense of accomplishment was an undercurrent of uncertainty. She had crossed a threshold into an unfamiliar world, and she wasn't sure what awaited her on the other side. As Rosa worked, Ethan Sinclair appeared in the doorway of the dining room, leaning against the frame with his hands tucked into his pockets. He looked at her with an expression that seemed equal parts curious and hesitant. "Rosa," he began, his voice softer than usual. "Can we talk?" Rosa straightened, placing the linen napkin she had been folding onto the table. "Of course, Ethan. What's on your mind?" He stepped into the room, his movements uncharacteristically awkward. I wanted to say you were incredible last night. The way you spoke, the way you held yourself, it was inspiring." Rosa smiled faintly, though her eyes reflected her lingering doubts. "Thank you. It wasn't easy." "I can imagine," Ethan said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "I don't think I could ever do something like that. Mum's always putting me in these situations where I have to perform, but I just feel, I don't know, trapped." Rosa studied him for a moment, noting the vulnerability in his posture. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her hands resting on the table. "Sometimes the hardest part is just showing up," she said gently. "It's not about being perfect, it's about being honest." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the table. "That's what I liked about what you said last night. It felt real, like you weren't trying to impress anyone. You were just you." Rosa's chest tightened at his words. "Thank you, Ethan. That means a lot." He hesitated, then looked up at her. "Can I ask you something? Do you ever get scared? Like when you're doing something new or stepping into the unknown?" "All the time," Rosa admitted, her voice steady but reflective. "But fear isn't always a bad thing. It means you care about what you're doing. The trick is not letting it stop you." Ethan nodded again, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Rosa said with a quiet laugh. "But it gets easier with practice." Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp click of heels on the marble floor. Vivian Sinclair entered the room, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. She looked between them, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Ethan," she said smoothly, "don't you have that meeting with your tutor this morning?" Ethan straightened, his casual demeanor replaced with the stiffness Rosa often saw him adopt around his mother. "Yeah, I was just heading there." Vivian watched him go, her expression unreadable. Once he was out of earshot, she turned her attention to Rosa. "You certainly seem to have made an impression," Vivian said, her tone carefully neutral. Rosa met her gaze, her own expression calm. "I was just answering his questions. He's a thoughtful young man." Vivian tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Yes, well, he's always been curious, sometimes to a fault." She stepped closer, her voice lowering. Last night went better than I expected. You handled yourself well." "Thank you," Rosa replied, her tone even. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." Vivian's smile widened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good. Let's hope you continue to meet expectations." As Vivian left the room, Rosa let out a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing. She had learned to navigate Vivian's sharp edges, but the encounter left her feeling as though she was balancing on a tightrope. Later that evening, Rosa returned home to Clara, who greeted her with an enthusiastic hug. The sight of her daughter's bright smile melted away the day's stress, grounding Rosa in the simplicity of their bond. "Mama, guess what?" Clara said, bouncing on her toes. "I got an A on my science test. My teacher said I might even be able to join the advanced group next semester." Rosa beamed, her pride swelling. "That's wonderful, mi amor." "I'm so proud of you." Clara grinned, then grew serious. "How was your day? Did anything exciting happen?" Rosa hesitated, unsure how much to share. "It was interesting. I talked to some new people, learned some new things." Clara tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever get scared, Mama, when you have to do something big?" Rosa's breath caught at the echo of Ethan's earlier question. She crouched down so they were eye level, placing her hands on Clara's shoulders. "Yes, I do, but you know what I tell myself." "What?" Clara asked, her voice soft. "That being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Rosa said. "It means doing what needs to be done, even when you are." Clara nodded solemnly, her small hands curling into Rosa's. "Then you're the bravest person I know." Rosa hugged her tightly, the weight of the day lifting as she held her daughter close. In that moment, she realized something profound. No matter what uncertainties lay ahead, she had already achieved her most important victory. She had shown Clara what it meant to face the world with strength and integrity. As they sat together on the worn couch, Clara chattering excitedly about her plans for the advanced class, Rosa allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them head-on, not just for Clara, but for herself. For the first time, she began to see the possibility of building a bridge between the life she had and the life she dreamed of. And in that vision, she found her courage. The Sinclair mansion hummed with activity, but not with the frenzied energy that accompanied Vivian's grand soirées. Instead, the house carried a quieter tension, the kind that preceded change. Rosa Morales moved through the halls with her usual quiet efficiency, though she was acutely aware of the shifts in the household. Vivian seemed more watchful, her sharp eyes often landing on Rosa as though calculating her next move. Ethan, by contrast, had grown more open, seeking her out for brief but meaningful conversations. Today, Rosa found herself in the kitchen, scrubbing the silverware from the previous evening's dinner. The rhythmic sound of water and clinking metal was soothing, a welcome reprieve from the emotional undercurrents she'd been navigating. She was lost in thought when the door swung open, and Ethan entered, his presence filling the small space. "Hey, Rosa," he greeted, his voice easy but tinged with something unspoken. Rosa glanced up, offering him a polite smile. "Hello, Ethan. How are you today?" "Good, I guess," he said, leaning against the counter. "I just wanted to thank you again for talking to me the other day. It helped." "I'm glad," Rosa replied, returning her attention to the sink. "Sometimes all we need is someone to listen." Ethan hesitated, then said, "Do you think people can change? Like, really change?" Rosa paused, her hands still submerged in the soapy water. She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "I think people can change if they want to. But it takes effort and time." Ethan nodded, his brow furrowed. "I've been thinking a lot about my mom. She's complicated. I know she loves me and Grace, But sometimes it feels like she cares more about what people think than about us. Rosa chose her words carefully. Your mother has lived a life that's very different from yours. Sometimes people get caught up in the expectations placed on them, and they lose sight of what really matters. Do you think she'll ever see it? Ethan asked, his voice quiet. I think she could, Rosa said gently. But it might take someone to help her see things differently. Ethan's gaze softened, and he nodded slowly. Thanks, Rosa. You always seem to know the right thing to say. Before she could respond, the kitchen door opened again, this time admitting Grace Sinclair. Her arrival was a surprise. Grace was rarely home, preferring the independence of her college life. She wore a tailored blazer over jeans, her posture confident but her expression wary. Am I interrupting something? Grace asked, her tone casual but edged with curiosity. Not at all, Rosa said, wiping her hands on a towel. It's good to see you, Grace. Grace offered a polite smile, though her attention shifted to Ethan. I was looking for you. Mom said we're having a family discussion later. Ethan grimaced. That sounds fun. Grace rolled her eyes. It's probably another lecture about legacy and responsibility. I swear, sometimes I think she forgets we're people and not just extensions of her. Rosa sensed the undercurrent of frustration in Grace's words and decided to steer the conversation. Your mother has high expectations. It can be hard to live up to them, Grace snorted. That's an understatement, but you seem to handle her better than we do. Rosa's lips curved into a faint smile. I've had practice. The siblings exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Rosa felt a flicker of hope as she watched them. Perhaps they were closer than they realized, bound by their shared experiences with their mother's formidable personality. As Grace and Ethan left the kitchen, Rosa returned to her work, her thoughts lingering on their conversation. She could see the cracks forming in the carefully constructed world Vivian had built, and she wondered how long it would take for them to widen. Later that evening, as Rosa prepared to leave for the day, Margaret Hewitt appeared in the doorway of the staff quarters. The older woman's presence was as steadying as ever, her kind eyes crinkling with a smile as she approached. Rosa, Margaret said warmly, do you have a moment? Of course, Mrs. Hewitt, Rosa replied, setting down her bag. Margaret gestured for Rosa to sit beside her on the worn couch. I've been thinking about what you said at the event, your story. It struck a chord with a lot of people, including me. Rosa's cheeks flushed. I only spoke from my heart, and that's why it resonated, Margaret said firmly. People are drawn to authenticity, Rosa. You have a gift for connecting with others, even when you don't realize it. Rosa looked down, her fingers twisting together. I'm not sure what to do with that gift. Margaret placed a hand on hers, the gesture both gentle and grounding. You don't have to have all the answers right now. But I want you to know that if you ever want to take that next step, to use your voice for something bigger, I'll be here to support you. The sincerity in Margaret's voice brought tears to Rosa's eyes. She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. That means more than I can say. As Margaret left, Rosa sat in the quiet of the room, the weight of her words sinking in. She had spent so long focusing on survival that she hadn't dared to dream of something more. But now, with the encouragement of people like Margaret, Ethan, and even Grace, she began to wonder if she could build a bridge to a life she had once thought unreachable. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, and for the first time, Rosa allowed herself to believe that she might be capable of crossing it. The Sinclair mansion was unusually quiet for an evening. The usual hum of social chatter and clinking glasses was absent, replaced by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Rosa Morales moved through the dimly lit corridors, her footsteps soft on the carpeted floors. She carried a tray of tea toward the sitting room, where Vivian Sinclair had summoned her for what she cryptically called a brief conversation. Rosa's mind was a careful swirl of thoughts. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, moments of empowerment clashing with moments of uncertainty. Her growing bond with Ethan and Grace, Margaret's unwavering support, and even Vivian's peculiar mix of manipulation and opportunity had created an intricate web she was still learning to navigate. When Rosa entered the sitting room, she found Vivian standing near the window, her silhouette framed by the glow of the city lights outside. She looked striking, as always, her tailored dress hugging her form, her posture exuding control. Rosa set the tray on a side table, her movements deliberate, and waited. Vivian turned, her sharp gaze locking onto Rosa. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the armchair across from her. Rosa complied, folding her hands in her lap. The silence stretched, taut and expectant, until Vivian finally spoke. "You've been busier lately." "I've been doing my job, Mrs. Sinclair," Rosa replied evenly, though she sensed the accusation beneath Vivian's words. "Yes, but you've also been building connections," Vivian said, her voice smooth but laced with steel. "With Margaret, with my children, even with some of my guests. Tell me, Rosa, what exactly are you hoping to achieve?" Rosa's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression calm. "I'm not hoping to achieve anything, Mrs. Sinclair. I'm simply doing my best to navigate the opportunities and challenges you've placed before me." Vivian's lips curved into a faint smile, though it lacked warmth. "You're clever, I'll give you that. But cleverness can be a dangerous thing, especially for someone in your position." Rosa held her gaze, refusing to let the implied threat unsettle her. "I've never seen myself as dangerous, ma'am. I'm just trying to provide for my daughter." Vivian's expression flickered, a momentary crack in her polished exterior. She walked to the tray and poured herself a cup of tea, her movements slow and deliberate. "I was like you once," she said quietly, almost to herself, "scraping and clawing my way out of circumstances I wouldn't wish on anyone." Rosa blinked, startled by the admission. Vivian rarely spoke of her past, preferring to present herself as a woman who had always lived in luxury. "I wasn't born into this life, Rosa," Vivian continued, her tone sharpening again. "Everything I have, I earned. And I've learned that survival in a world like this requires more than hard work. It requires control, discipline, power." Rosa's chest tightened. "I understand the importance of those things," she said carefully. "But I believe strength can come from compassion too, from lifting others up, not just yourself." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly, her grip on the teacup tightening. An admirable sentiment, but naive. Rosa didn't flinch. "It's what I've lived by, and it's gotten me this far." For a moment, the tension between them was palpable. Then Vivian exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "You're an intriguing woman, Rosa," she said, almost reluctantly. "But don't mistake intrigue for trust. I'm still deciding whether you're an asset or a liability." Rosa nodded, her voice steady. "I understand." Vivian studied her for a moment longer before waving a hand dismissively. "You may go." As Rosa left the sitting room, her mind buzzed with conflicting emotions. Vivian's words had revealed glimpses of a deeper, more vulnerable side to her, a side that was both surprising and unsettling. Yet they also carried a clear warning. Vivian was watching her closely, and any misstep could have consequences. Rosa returned to her quarters, her thoughts heavy. She sat on the edge of her small bed, pulling out her phone to check on Clara. The sight of her daughter's smiling face in a recent photo brought a wave of warmth that soothed the lingering tension. Clara was her anchor, the reason she endured everything this world threw at her. As Rosa set her phone down, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, his expression uncertain. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Rosa stepped aside, allowing him in. "Of course. What's wrong?" Ethan hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "It's Mom. I overheard her talking about you. She sounded, suspicious." Rosa's stomach twisted, though she kept her voice calm. "What did she say?" "She thinks you're positioning yourself like you're trying to take something from her." He sighed, his frustration evident. "I tried to tell her that's not who you are, but she wouldn't listen." Rosa placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Thank you for standing up for me, Ethan, but your mother is complicated. She's lived her life a certain way for so long that it's hard for her to see things differently." "I just don't want her to hurt you," Ethan said, his voice low. "You've been nothing but kind to me and Grace. You don't deserve this." Rosa's chest tightened, a mixture of gratitude and protectiveness swelling within her. "I appreciate that, Ethan. But don't worry about me. I've faced worse than this. I'll handle your mother." He nodded reluctantly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. Grace, too." "You're not alone." The sincerity in his words brought tears to Rosa's eyes, though she blinked them back. "Thank you," she said softly. As Ethan left, Rosa sat alone in the quiet room, her mind racing. Vivian's suspicion was a shadow she couldn't ignore, but the support of Ethan, Grace, and Margaret was a light that pierced through it. Rosa knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time, she felt truly prepared to face them. The Sinclair mansion was a storm of activity again, with the upcoming charity gala dominating every waking moment. Vivian had delegated tasks with her usual precision, her clipped instructions carrying an edge sharper than usual. Rosa Morales, as always, worked quietly in the background, yet she couldn't escape the weight of Vivian's gaze whenever they crossed paths. The events of their last conversation replayed in Rosa's mind as she polished the glassware in the dining room. Vivian's guarded vulnerability, her veiled warnings, and Ethan's earnest support had left Rosa navigating a delicate balance. The unspoken question lingered: how long could she keep her footing in a world where even kindness seemed like a calculated risk? As Rosa worked, Grace Sinclair entered the room. Unlike her brother, Grace carried herself with a composed elegance that hinted at her mother's influence. Yet, in moments of candidness, there was an openness about Grace that reminded Rosa of Ethan. "Rosa," Grace began, her tone hesitant. "Do you have a moment?" Rosa straightened, setting the glassware aside. "Of course, Miss Sinclair. What can I do for you?" Grace waved a hand dismissively. "Please, just call me Grace. I wanted to talk to you about my mother." Rosa's brow furrowed slightly, though she kept her expression neutral. "What about her?" Grace leaned against the dining table, her arms crossed. "I know she's been difficult lately, more than usual. She's been in this strange mood, and I think it's because of you." Rosa's heart skipped a beat. "Because of me?" Grace nodded. "I think she's threatened by you in a way. You've done something most people can't. You've gotten people to see beyond her carefully constructed image, and that scares her." Rosa felt a pang of unease, but also a flicker of curiosity. "Why would she feel threatened by me? I'm just doing my job." Grace smiled faintly. "That's just it. You're not just anything. You're more genuine, more real than most people in her life. It's not something she knows how to deal with." Rosa shook her head slightly. "I'm not trying to compete with her, Grace. I don't want her life or her position. I just want to do my work and give my daughter a better future." "I know that," Grace said softly. "But my mother, she doesn't see the world the way you do. She sees everything as a game, and everyone's a potential rival, Rosa sighed, her hands resting on the edge of the table. I don't want to play her games, but I also can't ignore her. She has a way of pulling people into her orbit. Grace tilted her head, studying Rosa. Maybe that's why you're the only person who has a chance of changing her. She respects you, even if she'd never admit it. The idea was both flattering and daunting. Rosa had never set out to change Vivian Sinclair, nor did she believe it was possible, yet Grace's words carried a note of hope that Rosa couldn't entirely dismiss. "Thank you for telling me this," Rosa said finally. "I'll do my best to navigate things carefully." Grace smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Good luck. You'll need it." The evening of the gala arrived, and the mansion was transformed into a glittering spectacle of wealth and elegance. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and gold accents, the tables adorned with arrangements of white roses and delicate orchids. Guests arrived in droves, their laughter and conversation filling the air. Rosa had been given another formal dress to wear, this time a deep green that complemented her warm complexion. She felt out of place among the polished crowd, but Margaret Hewitt's encouraging smile from across the room grounded her. Rosa busied herself ensuring everything ran smoothly, her movements precise but unobtrusive. As the evening progressed, Vivian took center stage to deliver her opening remarks. She stood poised beneath the largest chandelier, her crimson gown catching the light as she addressed the crowd with practiced charm. "Tonight," Vivian began, her voice carrying effortlessly, "we gather not only to celebrate our shared successes, but to support those who need us most. This gala is a testament to the power of generosity and the impact we can have when we come together." The applause that followed was enthusiastic but brief, and Vivian's eyes flicked toward Rosa for a split second, a gesture so subtle that most wouldn't have noticed. Rosa, however, felt the weight of it. After the speech, the evening unfolded in a blur of mingling and fundraising. Rosa found herself approached by several guests, some of whom recognized her from previous events. Their words were kind, though Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that many were more intrigued by her presence than genuinely invested in her story. Near the end of the evening, Rosa stepped out onto the terrace for a moment of reprieve. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the heat of the ballroom, and she leaned against the railing, staring out at the city lights. "Escaping the chaos," a voice said behind her. Rosa turned to see Ethan, his tie loosened, his expression easygoing. She smiled faintly, "Just catching my breath." He joined her at the railing, his gaze on the skyline. "You did great tonight. People are still talking about you." Rosa shrugged. "I didn't do much." "You didn't have to," Ethan said. "Sometimes just being yourself is enough." Rosa glanced at him, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his tone. "Thank you, Ethan," he smiled, but it was fleeting. I wish Mum could see what we see. The way you inspire people, the way you remind us of what really matters." Rosa placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Your mother has her own way of seeing the world, but maybe if we show her enough patience and compassion, she'll start to see it differently." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe." As they stood together under the stars, Rosa felt a quiet determination settle within her. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. And that made all the difference. The gala had left the Sinclair mansion in a temporary state of disarray. While the staff worked tirelessly to restore order, Rosa Morales focused on her usual tasks, finding solace in the rhythm of cleaning and organizing. Yet her mind refused to quiet. The moments shared with Ethan on the terrace, the veiled glances from Vivian, and the whispers of admiration from the guests still echoed in her thoughts. It was mid-afternoon when the unexpected happened. Rosa was in the library, dusting the towering shelves, when Vivian walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. Rosa paused, straightening immediately, her hands clutching the duster as though it might anchor her in the sudden tension. "Rosa," Vivian began, her voice crisp but not unkind, "do you have a moment?" "Of course, Mrs. Sinclair," Rosa replied, setting the duster aside. Vivian gestured toward the armchairs by the window. "Sit." Rosa hesitated, but obeyed, lowering herself into one of the chairs. Vivian took the seat opposite her, crossing her legs gracefully and resting her hands on the arms of the chair. For a moment, she said nothing, her sharp gaze fixed on Rosa as though measuring her. "You've become quite the topic of conversation lately," Vivian said finally. "At the gala, during the events leading up to it. People are intrigued by you." Rosa met Vivian's gaze evenly. "I've only been doing what you've asked of me, Mrs. Sinclair." Vivian's lips curved into a faint smile. "And yet, you've done more than that. You've managed to turn their intrigue into admiration. A rare skill, I'll admit." Rosa remained silent, sensing there was more to come. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening, but admiration can be a double-edged sword. It can elevate you or it can put a target on your back. And in this world, people are always looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. Rosa felt the weight of Vivian's words, but refused to be intimidated. "I've spent my life learning how to survive, Mrs. Sinclair. I'm not afraid of challenges." Vivian's smile widened, though it remained tinged with something darker. "Good, because challenges are inevitable, especially when you're walking the path you've chosen." "What path is that?" Rosa asked, her tone steady. Vivian tilted her head, studying Rosa with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "The one where you become more than what you are now, where you start to realize your potential and others start to take notice." Rosa hesitated, her thoughts racing. Vivian's words were laced with both encouragement and warning, a delicate balance that left Rosa unsure of the older woman's true intentions. "I'm not trying to become anything I'm not," Rosa said carefully. "I'm just trying to provide for my daughter and give her the opportunities I never had." Vivian's expression softened, just for a moment. "A noble goal. But don't underestimate how the choices you make now will shape the life she sees. You're setting an example, whether you realize it or not." The words struck a chord, and Rosa felt a pang of both pride and responsibility. She nodded slowly, her voice quieter but no less resolute. "I understand." Vivian rose gracefully, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "Good. Then we'll see how far you can take this." With that, she left, her presence lingering in the room long after she had gone. That evening, Rosa returned to her apartment, the familiar warmth of home a welcome contrast to the calculated elegance of the mansion. Clara greeted her with her usual enthusiasm, her bright eyes lighting up as she launched into a detailed account of her day at school. "Mama, guess what?" Clara said, practically bouncing as she spoke. "My teacher asked me to help with the science fair next month. She said I have a real talent for explaining things." Rosa smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's wonderful, mi amor. I'm so proud of you." Clara beamed, then paused, her expression turning serious. "Mama, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Rosa said, sitting beside her on the worn couch. "What is it?" "Are you happy?" Clara asked, her voice soft but filled with earnestness. The question caught Rosa off guard. She stared at her daughter, her chest tightening as she considered her answer. "Why do you ask, Clara?" Clara shrugged, though her eyes remained focused on her mother. "You've been working so hard, and I want to make sure you're okay." Rosa reached out, pulling Clara into a gentle embrace. "I'm happy when I'm with you," she said honestly. "You're the reason I keep going." "But what about you?" Clara pressed. "What makes you happy, besides me?" The question lingered, heavy and unspoken, as Rosa held her daughter close. For so long, Rosa's happiness had been secondary to survival, her dreams sacrificed for the sake of providing a stable life for Clara. Yet, in that moment, Rosa realized something profound. Her happiness mattered, too. Not just for herself, but for Clara, to show her daughter that it was possible to thrive, not just endure. "I think I'm still figuring that out," Rosa admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But I promise, I'm working on it." Clara nodded against her shoulder, her small arms tightening around Rosa. "I love you, Mama." "I love you too, mi amor," Rosa whispered, her resolve solidifying. As they sat together in the quiet of their home, Rosa felt a newfound clarity. Vivian's words, though shrouded in ambiguity, had sparked something within her. The path ahead was uncertain, but Rosa knew one thing for sure. She would walk it with courage, for herself and for Clara. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding a way to truly live. The Sinclair mansion was unusually quiet in the early morning, with the soft hum of distant traffic the only sound breaking the stillness. Rosa Morales walked through the empty halls, her shoes making barely a whisper against the polished wood floors. She felt the familiar weight of her duties, yet her mind buzzed with something more, an inexplicable energy that came from the realization she had shared with Clara the night before. Today felt different. There was a resolve in Rosa's step, a determination that filled the spaces where self-doubt had once lived. She was still Rosa, a mother and a worker, but she was also a woman, beginning to see the value in her own voice and ambitions. Her first task of the morning took her to the library, where she was tasked with reorganizing some of the rare books that Vivian insisted on displaying but never read. Rosa had barely begun when the door creaked open and Ethan entered, his hair disheveled and his tie loosely knotted. He carried a cup of coffee, the steam curling upward. "Rosa," he greeted, his tone light but distracted. "What are you doing here so early?" "Just working," Rosa replied, glancing up from the row of books. "What about you? Don't you have school today?" Ethan shrugged, setting the coffee cup on a nearby table. "I do, but I needed a break. Mom's been on edge, and it's exhausting." Rosa nodded knowingly. "She does have a way of keeping everyone on their toes." Ethan leaned against the edge of the table, his expression thoughtful. "I don't get her sometimes. It's like she's always trying to prove something, but I don't know to who." Rosa paused, her fingers brushing the spines of the books. "Maybe she's trying to prove something to herself." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Rosa turned to face him fully. "Sometimes people who seem the strongest are the ones carrying the heaviest burdens. They try to control everything because it's their way of protecting themselves from feeling vulnerable." Ethan studied her, his gaze softening. "Do you think she'll ever stop?" Rosa offered a small smile. "Maybe, if she feels like she doesn't have to control everything anymore." Ethan seemed to consider this, then sighed. "I wish I could tell her that. But every time I try to talk to her, it feels like I'm hitting a wall." "Walls take time to break down," Rosa said gently. "But you're doing more than you realize just by trying." Ethan gave her a faint smile. "Thanks, Rosa. You always know what to say." Before he could leave, Grace appeared in the doorway, her heels clicking against the hardwood as she walked in. She carried her usual air of confidence, though her expression held a trace of unease. "Ethan," she said, her tone brisk, "Mom's looking for you. Something about a meeting she forgot to tell you about." Ethan groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Of course she did. Grace turned her attention to Rosa, her expression softening. "Morning, Rosa. How are you?" "Good, thank you," Rosa replied. "You seem busy." Grace let out a short laugh. "That's one way to put it. Mom's been in overdrive since the gala. I think she's planning something else, but she won't tell anyone what it is." Rosa raised an eyebrow. "Another event?" Grace shrugged. "It's hard to say. She's been unusually quiet, which usually means she's plotting something big." Ethan shot Rosa a look, as if to say, "This is exactly what I mean." "Well," Grace continued, glancing at her watch, "I'd better get going." "Don't let her rope you into anything, Ethan." With that, she left, her heels clicking away down the hall. Ethan sighed again, picking up his coffee. "Wish me luck," Rosa smiled. "Good luck." Later that day, Rosa found herself summoned to Vivian's office, a room she rarely entered. It was as pristine and intimidating as its owner, with its sleek black desk, floor-to-ceiling windows, and minimalist decor. Vivian sat behind the desk, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. "Rosa," Vivian began as Rosa stepped inside. "Sit." Rosa obeyed, taking the chair opposite Vivian's. She felt the tension in the room but kept her expression neutral. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," Vivian said, her tone measured. "About compassion and strength." Rosa blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected Vivian to bring it up again, much less admit to reflecting on it. "I don't necessarily agree with you," Vivian continued, "but I've come to realize that there's value in your perspective." Rosa chose her next words carefully. "I appreciate you saying that, Mrs. Sinclair." Vivian leaned back slightly, her gaze narrowing. "I've also noticed the way you've connected with my children. Grace speaks highly of you. And Ethan." "Well, he trusts you more than he trusts me." Rosa's stomach tightened. "I'm not trying to come between you and your children, Mrs. Sinclair." Vivian waved a hand dismissively. "I know that, but it's made me realize something. I've spent so much time trying to mold them into what I think they should be, that I may have forgotten to let them be who they are." Rosa hesitated, unsure how to respond. Vivian's admission felt like a rare crack in her armor, and Rosa didn't want to overstep. "They see you as a role model, Rosa," Vivian said, her voice softening. "And perhaps I should start seeing you that way too." The words hit Rosa like a wave, leaving her momentarily speechless. "Thank you," she said finally. "That means a lot." Vivian nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "Don't let it go to your head." As Rosa left the office, her thoughts raced. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of true understanding between herself and Vivian, a fragile bridge beginning to form. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start, and for Rosa, that was enough to keep moving forward. The days following Rosa's conversation with Vivian unfolded with a peculiar mix of tension and quiet. The Sinclair mansion hummed with its usual rhythm of meticulous order, but there was an air of uncertainty in the spaces between. Rosa felt it in the way Vivian's gaze lingered a moment too long, or in how Grace and Ethan seemed to tread carefully around their mother. Rosa, however, maintained her routine with steadfast composure. Her every action was deliberate, though her thoughts were increasingly preoccupied by the shifting dynamics in the house. Vivian's words had planted a seed of doubt and possibility, leaving Rosa to wonder if the bridges forming between them were sturdy enough to bear the weight of what might come. It was during an unassuming morning in the kitchen that Ethan found Rosa again, his familiar presence breaking through the rhythm of her work. He carried a book in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, his expression tinged with an air of hesitation. "Rosa," he began, leaning against the counter. "Do you have a second?" Rosa looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, offering him a small smile. "For you, always." He set the book down on the counter and ran a hand through his hair. I don't know how to say this, but I feel like things are changing. With Mom, with everything. Rosa paused, placing the knife down carefully. What do you mean? Ethan's shoulders slumped slightly, the confidence he usually carried slipping for a moment. It's like she's trying, to be different, but I can't tell if it's real or if it's just another one of her strategies. Rosa considered his words carefully. Sometimes change starts as a strategy, but that doesn't mean it can't become real. Ethan's brow furrowed. Do you think she can change after everything? Rosa met his gaze, her voice steady. I think anyone can change if they want to, but it's not easy. And it doesn't happen overnight. Ethan nodded, though his expression remained troubled. I just don't want to get my hopes up. Rosa reached out, placing a hand on his arm. It's okay to hope, Ethan, even if it's hard. He smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. You always make things sound so simple. They're not, Rosa replied, her tone soft but firm. But sometimes simplicity is what we need to focus on. Before Ethan could respond, Grace appeared in the doorway, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. She held a tablet in her hand, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. Ethan, she said, her voice brisk, Mom's asking for you. She's in her office. Ethan groaned but nodded. Of course she is. Grace turned to Rosa, her tone softening. Are you okay? You've been dealing with a lot lately. Rosa smiled, appreciating the concern. I'm fine, Grace, thank you. Grace hesitated, then nodded, her expression thoughtful. Let us know if you need anything. Seriously. Rosa's heart warmed at the sincerity in Grace's voice. I will. Thank you. As the siblings left, Rosa returned to her work, her thoughts lingering on their words. The growing bond between her and the Sinclair children was both comforting and complicated. She valued their trust but knew that it also placed her in a delicate position, especially as Vivian continued to navigate her own unspoken transformation. Later that afternoon, Rosa found herself summoned to Vivian's office once again. The room was as pristine as ever, its minimalist decor contrasting sharply with the weight of the conversations that often took place there. Vivian sat behind her sleek black desk, her hands folded neatly on the surface. Rosa, Vivian began as Rosa stepped inside. Thank you for coming. Rosa inclined her head politely. Of course, Mrs. Sinclair. Vivian gestured for her to sit, her expression unreadable. I've been thinking a lot about the direction this household is heading, about the kind of example I want to set for my children. Rosa settled into the chair opposite Vivian, her posture attentive but calm. That's an important thing to consider. Vivian's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it lacked her usual sharpness. You're very diplomatic, Rosa. It's one of your many talents. Rosa remained silent, waiting for Vivian to continue. I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything, Vivian admitted, her voice quieter than usual. And I see now that it's cost me more than I'd like to admit. Rosa's chest tightened at the vulnerability in Vivian's tone. Change is hard, she said gently, but it's never too late to start. Vivian's gaze met Rosa's, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. You make it sound so simple. It's not, Rosa replied, echoing her earlier words to Ethan. But simplicity can be a good place to begin. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Then Vivian leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. I'm going to try, she said, her voice resolute, for Ethan and Grace, and for myself. Rosa nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. That's all anyone can ask. As she left the office, Rosa felt a strange mix of hope and trepidation. Vivian's words carried the promise of change, but promises were fragile things. Still, Rosa chose to believe in the possibility, not just for Vivian, but for herself and the family they were slowly becoming. For the first time, Rosa felt as though she was standing at a crossroads, the paths before her illuminated by both uncertainty and hope. And in that moment, she realized she was ready to take the next step, whatever it might be. The days after Rosa's conversation with Vivian passed with a strange calm that felt more like the quiet before a storm. The Sinclair mansion carried on as usual, but beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of unease. Rosa Morales could feel it in the way the staff moved with heightened vigilance, in the sharpness of Vivian's commands, and in the subdued tones of Grace and Ethan's conversations. It was a late afternoon when Rosa found herself in the expansive garden behind the mansion, trimming back the overgrown lavender bushes. The repetitive motion of the shears in her hands helped calm her restless thoughts. The crisp scent of freshly cut lavender mixed with the faint hum of bees flitting from flower to flower, offering a rare moment of peace. She wasn't alone for long. Ethan approached, his hands in his pockets, his usual easygoing demeanor tempered by something heavier. Rosa glanced up as he stopped a few feet away, his gaze scanning the garden before landing on her. "Need some help?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Rosa smiled faintly, gesturing toward a pair of gloves resting on the stone bench. "If you're offering, I won't say no." Ethan slid on the gloves and took the shears she handed him, moving to the opposite side of the bush. For a while, they worked in silence, the snip of the blades filling the air. It wasn't until the bush was nearly trimmed that Ethan spoke again. "I think Mum's actually trying," he said, his voice hesitant. "She's been different lately, quieter, like she's thinking about something big." Rosa glanced at him, her hands still. "That's a good thing, isn't it?" Ethan shrugged, a frown tugging at his lips. "I don't know. It's hard to trust. Every time I've gotten my hopes up, she's let me down." Rosa set the shears aside, her gaze steady on Ethan. "People don't change overnight, Ethan. It's a process, and sometimes it takes a long time to see the results." Ethan looked down, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, but what if the change isn't real? What if it's just another way for her to control things?" "That's a possibility," Rosa admitted, "but you won't know unless you give her a chance." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's hard to believe in her when she's spent so much of her life trying to be someone else." Rosa placed a gentle hand on his arm, her voice soft but firm. "Belief isn't easy. But if you want her to change, you have to show her that you believe she can. It's a two-way street." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained conflicted. "I'll try. I just don't want to get hurt again." As Ethan returned to the house, Rosa watched him go, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She knew all too well the pain of broken trust, the difficulty of rebuilding a connection when the foundation had been shaken. Yet she also knew that healing required patience and a willingness to take risks. That evening, the tension in the Sinclair household reached a quiet peak. Rosa had just finished tidying the living room when Grace appeared, her face set in a rare expression of unease. "Rosa," Grace said, her voice low, "do you have a moment?" Rosa nodded, setting the throw pillow she had been arranging back in place. "Of course." "What's on your mind?" Grace hesitated, her arms crossed as though bracing herself. "It's about Mom. She's been different lately, and I don't know if it's good or bad." Rosa gestured for her to sit on the couch, taking the seat across from her. "What makes you say that?" "She's been talking about making changes," Grace said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "About being more present, more human, I guess. But it feels so out of character. Like she's trying to convince herself more than anyone else." Rosa studied Grace's face, noting the mixture of hope and skepticism in her eyes. "Change is hard," Rosa said gently, "and for someone like your mother, who's built her life on control, it can feel almost impossible, but it sounds like she's trying." Grace leaned back, letting out a humorless laugh. Trying. That's new for her. Maybe she's realizing that the way she's been living isn't sustainable, Rosa suggested. Maybe she's ready to find something more meaningful. Grace shook her head, her expression softening. "I want to believe that. I really do. But it's hard to forget everything that's come before." "You don't have to forget," Rosa said. "But forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about letting go of the weight that's holding you down." Grace looked at Rosa, her gaze lingering. "How do you do it? Stay so calm, so hopeful?" Rosa smiled faintly. "I've had a lot of practice, and I've learned that hope is a choice. It's not always easy, but it's worth it." Grace nodded slowly, a small smile breaking through her worry. "You're amazing, Rosa. I don't know how this house functioned before you came along." Rosa chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I'm just doing my best." As Grace left the room, Rosa felt a sense of quiet resolve settle over her. The Sinclair family was at a crossroads, and she was beginning to see how much her presence mattered, not just as a caretaker, but as a catalyst for something greater. Whether or not Vivian's transformation was genuine, Rosa knew she had a role to play in helping this family find its way. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that her efforts were making a difference, and that belief, fragile but real, gave her the strength to keep moving forward. The late afternoon sun streamed through the Sinclair mansion's grand windows, casting long golden rays across the polished floors. Rosa Morales stood in the kitchen, organizing the fresh produce delivered earlier that day. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, yet her thoughts drifted to the quiet exchanges she'd had with Grace and Ethan over the past few days. Their guarded hope and uncertainty mirrored her own feelings toward Vivian, whose enigmatic shifts in behavior had left Rosa wondering what was truly at play. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden arrival of Margaret Hewitt. Margaret's presence always carried a sense of warmth and calm, but today her sharp eyes betrayed a subtle intensity. She entered the kitchen with a deliberate pace, setting her leather handbag on the counter. "Rosa," Margaret greeted, her tone measured but kind. "I was hoping to catch you before the day got away from us." Rosa smiled faintly, wiping her hands on a towel. "Mrs. Hewitt, it's always a pleasure. What brings you here?" Margaret pulled out a chair at the small table near the window and gestured for Rosa to sit. "I wanted to talk to you about Vivian." The mention of Vivian sent a ripple of apprehension through Rosa, but she masked it well, taking the seat across from Margaret. "What about her?" Margaret leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "I've known Vivian for a long time, longer than most people in her life now. And while I've seen her at her best, I've also seen her at her worst. Lately, I've been noticing cracks." Rosa tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "She's been different recently, quieter, more reflective." Margaret nodded. "Exactly. And while I want to believe it's a sign of growth, I know Vivian well enough to recognize that she's carrying something heavy. Something she hasn't shared with anyone." Rosa hesitated, her mind turning over the implications of Margaret's words. "Do you think she's capable of letting someone in, of being vulnerable?" Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "I think she is, but it will take someone she trusts implicitly, and that's not an easy thing for Vivian." Rosa glanced down at her hands, the weight of Margaret's observation settling over her. "She doesn't trust easily," Rosa admitted. "But she's shown glimpses of it, with Ethan, with Grace, and even with me. That's why I wanted to talk to you." Margaret said, her voice steady. "You've become an important presence in this house, Rosa. You've managed to connect with her children in ways even she hasn't, and I think you're in a unique position to help her, if you're willing." Rosa's breath caught at the enormity of the suggestion. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that," she said softly. "Vivian and we're so different." Margaret reached across the table, placing a gentle hand over Rosa's. "And that's exactly why you might be the only person who can reach her. She needs someone who can see her for who she is, not just the image she projects." Rosa swallowed hard, the gravity of Margaret's words settling into her chest. She nodded slowly, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll do what I can." Margaret smiled warmly, her hand giving Rosa's a reassuring squeeze. "That's all anyone can ask." That evening, Rosa found herself summoned to Vivian's private sitting room. The space was more intimate than the formal areas of the mansion, with softer lighting and personal touches. A framed photograph of Grace and Ethan as children, a worn leather journal on the side table. Vivian was seated on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, her posture unusually relaxed. "Rosa," Vivian said as Rosa entered, "sit with me." Rosa obeyed, taking the chair across from her. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, waiting for Vivian to speak. For a long moment, Vivian said nothing, her gaze fixed on the wine swirling in her glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Rosa had ever heard it. "Do you ever feel like you're carrying something so heavy that it might break you?" Rosa's heart ached at the vulnerability in Vivian's tone. "Yes," she replied honestly. "I've felt that many times." Vivian looked up, her eyes searching Rosa's face. "How do you keep going?" Rosa hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I remind myself why I'm carrying it. For my daughter. For the life I'm building for her. And I remind myself that even the heaviest burdens don't last forever." Vivian let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," Rosa said gently, "but it's a choice. And sometimes, making that choice every day is the hardest part." Vivian set her glass down, her hands trembling slightly. "I've made so many mistakes, Rosa. I've hurt people I care about, pushed them away because it felt safer than letting them in." Rosa leaned forward, her voice steady but soft. "It's not too late to change that. It's never too late to try." Vivian looked at Rosa, her expression a mix of gratitude and fear. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," Rosa said firmly, "but it starts with being honest, with yourself and with the people you care about." Vivian nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Rosa said, "and you don't have to do it all at once. One step at a time." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. Vivian's guarded walls, so carefully constructed over the years, seemed to waver. Rosa knew that trust would take time, but in that moment she felt something shift, a tentative opening, a glimmer of possibility. As Rosa left the sitting room, she carried with her the weight of Vivian's words, but also a newfound sense of purpose. She had been asked to help carry someone else's burden, and though the path ahead was uncertain, Rosa knew she would do her best to lighten the load. The air in the Sinclair mansion felt heavier than usual the next morning, as though the emotions shared in Vivian's sitting room the night before still lingered. Rosa Morales went about her tasks with a focused determination, though her thoughts drifted to the vulnerability Vivian had shown. It was a side of her employer Rosa hadn't expected to see, and it carried with it the weight of unspoken questions. As Rosa polished the silverware in the dining room, Grace entered, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She carried a tablet in one hand, her expression distracted but not unkind. Spotting Rosa, Grace paused, lowering the tablet. "Rosa," Grace said, her voice softer than usual, "do you have a minute?" Rosa looked up, setting the silverware aside. Of course. Is something wrong? Grace hesitated, leaning against the edge of the table. Not wrong, exactly, but I've been thinking about Mom. She's different lately. I don't know if it's real or if she's just trying to put on another performance. Rosa studied Grace's face, seeing the uncertainty that mirrored her brother Ethan's. What makes you think it might be a performance? Rosa asked gently. Grace sighed, crossing her arms, because that's who she's always been. Everything she does is calculated, but then there are moments, little things, that make me wonder if she's actually trying. Rosa nodded thoughtfully. Change doesn't come easily for anyone, Grace, especially for someone like your mother, who spent so much of her life building walls to protect herself. Grace frowned, her fingers tapping idly against the tablet. But why now? What's making her want to change? Rosa hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes it takes losing something, or the fear of losing it, to make us see what really matters. Grace's gaze softened, her arms relaxing at her sides. You think she's afraid of losing us? I think she's starting to realize what she stands to lose if she doesn't change, Rosa said, and that's a powerful motivator. Grace nodded slowly, her expression contemplative. Maybe you're right. I want to believe her. I want to believe that she can be the mother we've always needed. Rosa offered a small smile, her voice steady. Believing in someone is the first step to helping them believe in themselves. Grace's lips quirked into a faint smile, though her eyes still held a hint of doubt. You're annoyingly wise, Rosa. Rosa chuckled softly, shaking her head. Not wise, just experienced. Grace straightened, her expression warming. Well, whatever it is, we're lucky to have you. Don't let her scare you off, okay? She doesn't scare me, Rosa said simply. I've seen too much to be scared by someone like Vivian, Grace laughed, the sound light but genuine. You're braver than I am. As Grace left the room, Rosa returned to her work, her thoughts churning. The threads of connection between the Sinclair family members were fragile but present, and Rosa felt an increasing responsibility to help strengthen them. Whether or not she could truly bridge the gaps between them remained to be seen, but she was willing to try. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mansion in a warm amber glow, Rosa found herself in the garden, pruning the hedges. The rhythmic snip of the shears was soothing, allowing her a rare moment of peace. She wasn't alone for long, however. Ethan appeared, his presence quiet but purposeful. Rosa, he called softly, stepping closer. I figured I'd find you here. Rosa looked up, smiling faintly. It's my favorite place to clear my head. Ethan nodded, leaning against the garden bench. I get that. Sometimes I come out here at night, just to think. Rosa returned to her task, her tone light. And what's on your mind tonight? He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Mom, I've been trying to figure her out, but it's like every time I think I understand her, she changes. Rosa glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. People are complicated, Ethan. Your mother more than most, but she's trying, and that's worth something. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I want to believe that, I really do, but it's hard. She spent so much time being, well, her. It's hard to imagine her as anything else. Rosa set the shears aside, turning to face him fully. Change doesn't erase who someone was, Ethan. It adds to who they are. Your mother will always have parts of her that are difficult to understand, but that doesn't mean she can't grow into someone better. Ethan's gaze softened, his voice quieter. You really think she can change? I think she can, Rosa said firmly, but she'll need your support and your patience. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I'll try. For Grace and for myself." Rosa smiled, reaching out to place a comforting hand on his shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask." As Ethan left the garden, Rosa sat on the bench, her gaze drifting to the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. The Sinclair family's journey toward healing was far from over, but the small moments of connection she had witnessed gave her hope. They were learning to see each other not as roles to be played, but as people with flaws, strengths, and a shared desire for something better. For Rosa, that was enough to keep going. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about helping others find their way, and in doing so, she was discovering her own path, one step at a time. The following morning began with the same quiet hum of routine in the Sinclair mansion. Yet Rosa Morales could feel an undercurrent of anticipation rippling through the air. Vivian had summoned the family to a late breakfast, an unusual event given her tendency to keep her children at arm's length. The notion of all four of them sitting together at the grand dining table was almost unthinkable. Rosa busied herself in the kitchen, helping the chef with the finishing touches. The aroma of freshly baked croissants and brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of polished wood from the dining room. As she arranged a platter of fruit, she glanced out the kitchen door, watching as Grace and Ethan made their way to the table. Grace's heels clicked confidently on the floor, while Ethan's tie hung loosely around his neck, his usual casualness intact. Vivian entered last, her movements deliberate and her gaze sweeping the room. She wore a navy blue dress, understated yet elegant, and her hair was perfectly coiffed. There was a tension in her posture, as if she were bracing herself for a conversation she couldn't avoid. Rosa lingered in the background, discreet but observant. She didn't expect to stay for long, but the palpable unease in the air kept her rooted to the spot. "Thank you for coming," Vivian began, her voice steady but softer than usual. She glanced at Grace and Ethan, her hands resting lightly on the back of her chair. "I realize it's not often that I ask for your time like this." Grace arched an eyebrow, her tone cautious. "You're right, it's not." Ethan shifted in his seat, his gaze flickering between Vivian and Grace. "What's this about, Mom?" Vivian took a deep breath, her fingers tightening on the chair for a moment before she sat. "I wanted to talk to both of you about the way things have been, about us." Grace and Ethan exchanged a glance. The skepticism in their eyes mirrored perfectly. Vivian clasped her hands on the table, her expression unreadable. "I know I haven't always been the mother you needed. I've made mistakes, more than I care to admit. And for a long time, I thought that keeping things under control, keeping a certain image, was what mattered most." "Sounds about right," Grace muttered, crossing her arms. Vivian's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond to the jab. Instead, she continued, her voice quieter. "But I've started to realize that I was wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of things." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his expression softening despite the guarded edge in his voice. "What's changed, Mom?" Vivian hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the windows before returning to her children. "I've seen how much I've been holding on to, control, expectations, pride, and I've seen what it's cost me. I don't want to lose you, either of you." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint clink of Rosa setting down the fruit platter. She moved quietly, her presence barely noticeable as she stepped back toward the kitchen door. But as she turned to leave, Vivian spoke again. "Rosa," Vivian said, her voice steady but laced with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Stay, please." Rosa froze, then nodded, returning to her discreet spot near the sideboard. She felt the weight of the family's collective gaze, but kept her expression neutral. Grace was the first to break the silence, her tone sharp but not unkind. "So, what does this mean, Mom? You're just changing overnight?" Vivian shook her head. "No, I know this isn't something that can be fixed with words, but I want to try. I want to start doing things differently." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, his voice low. "It's hard to believe you just wake up one day and decide to change." "I didn't," Vivian admitted. "It's been building for a while, and honestly, Rosa's had a lot to do with it." Rosa's eyes widened slightly, though she quickly schooled her expression. Grace and Ethan turned to her, their curiosity evident. "Rosa's shown me what it means to be strong without needing to control everything," Vivian continued. "She's reminded me of the value of honesty, of humility, and she's made me realize that it's not too late to be better." Grace leaned back in her chair, her arms still crossed but her expression less defensive. "Well, she's not wrong. Rosa's pretty amazing." Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She is..." Rosa felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her head high. "I'm just doing my best, like anyone else." Vivian smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time. "Your best has been more than enough, for all of us." For the next hour, the family sat together, their conversation tentative but genuine. Vivian listened more than she spoke, her usual sharpness replaced with quiet attentiveness. Grace and Ethan slowly began to open up, their walls not fully lowered but showing cracks of vulnerability. Rosa watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and hope. The Sinclairs were far from perfect, but for the first time they were trying, not for appearances, but for each other. As the breakfast wound down, Vivian turned to Rosa with an expression of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Rosa nodded, her voice steady. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Sinclair." And as she cleared the table and returned to the kitchen, Rosa felt a quiet certainty take root within her. She had become more than an observer in the Sinclair family's journey. She was part of their fragile steps forward, a bridge helping them navigate their way towards something better. And for Rosa, that was worth every challenge she had faced. The afternoon sun spilled into the Sinclair mansion, casting golden light over the grand foyer as the house settled into an unusual calm. Rosa Morales had spent the day balancing her routine tasks with quiet reflection. The family breakfast earlier had left her with a strange mix of hope and apprehension. For the first time, she had witnessed a genuine effort by Vivian to break through the barriers she had spent years constructing. But Rosa knew the path to real change was rarely smooth. As Rosa wiped down the polished staircase railing, Grace appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression unreadable. She descended with her phone in hand, her heels clicking rhythmically against the wooden steps. Catching sight of Rosa, she paused, tucking her phone into her pocket. "Rosa," Grace said, her tone casual but tinged with hesitation. "Do you have a minute?" Rosa straightened, setting her cloth aside. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Grace leaned against the railing, her arms crossed. "That breakfast this morning, I don't even know what to think about it. Mom actually listening to us, apologizing. It felt surreal." Rosa offered a small smile, her voice calm. "It's not easy for someone like your mother to admit when she's wrong, but she's trying, Grace. That has to mean something." Grace sighed, her fingers tapping idly against the banister. "I want to believe it, I really do, but I've seen her act like this before, only for everything to go back to how it was." "People don't change overnight," Rosa said gently, "but if you give her a chance, she might surprise you." Grace studied Rosa for a moment, her expression softening. "You always know what to say. How do you stay so balanced through all of this?" Rosa chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I've learned to take things one day at a time." And I remind myself why I'm here, what's important. Grace nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. I guess I could learn a thing or two from you. Rosa smiled, but before she could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed from Vivian's office. Both women turned toward the source, their expressions tightening, Grace's brows furrowed, and she started toward the hallway. "Stay here," Grace said, her tone firm. "I'll handle it." Rosa hesitated, watching as Grace disappeared down the hall. The tension in the air thickened, but Rosa kept her composure, her instincts urging her to stay within earshot. She moved closer to the hallway, careful not to intrude but listening for any sign that she might be needed. From the office, Vivian's voice rang out, sharp but strained. "Ethan, I'm trying to have a conversation with you. And I'm trying to understand why you're suddenly so interested." Ethan shot back, his tone defensive. "You can't just decide to be involved now and expect everything to be fine." "I know I've made mistakes," Vivian replied, her voice quieter but no less intense. "But I'm trying to fix them. Can't you at least meet me halfway?" The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the muffled sound of footsteps as Grace entered the room. "Okay, what's going on?" Grace demanded, her voice carrying an edge of authority. "Ask Mom," Ethan said bitterly. "She's the one who dragged me in here." "I asked you in here because I want to talk," Vivian said, her frustration barely contained. "But it feels like no matter what I do, I can't get through to either of you." "That's because you've spent years treating us like props in your perfect little world," Ethan retorted. "How are we supposed to trust you now?" Grace's voice softened, though it carried a note of warning. "Ethan, that's enough." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Is it, or are we just supposed to pretend like everything's fine now?" Rosa's heart ached at the raw emotion in Ethan's voice. She edged closer, debating whether to intervene when Grace's voice rang out again. "Mom's trying," Grace said, her tone firm. "And yeah, it's not going to fix everything overnight, but if we don't at least give her a chance, then what's the point?" The room fell silent, and Rosa felt the weight of the family's unspoken pain pressing against the walls. She stepped back, giving them space, but ready to step in if needed. After what felt like an eternity, the office door opened and Grace emerged, her expression tight but composed. She spotted Rosa waiting in the hall and offered a small nod, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's complicated," Grace said quietly, "but I think we made some progress." Rosa smiled gently. "That's a start." Grace exhaled, her gaze steady on Rosa. "You should have been in there. You'd probably have fixed everything in 5 minutes." Rosa chuckled softly. "Some things can only be fixed from within." Grace nodded, her expression softening. "Thanks, Rosa, for everything." As Grace walked away, Rosa lingered in the hallway, her thoughts heavy yet hopeful. The cracks in the Sinclair family's foundation were deep, but they were beginning to mend, slowly and imperfectly. Rosa knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew that even the smallest steps could lead to profound change. For now, that was enough. And Rosa was determined to keep walking beside them, no matter where the path led. The tension in the Sinclair mansion lingered like a storm cloud after the confrontation in Vivian's office. Rosa Morales moved through the house with practiced ease, her focus on her duties providing a semblance of normalcy. Yet she couldn't shake the echoes of Ethan's words or the pain in Vivian's voice. The fragile connections forming within the family were being tested, and Rosa hoped they would hold. Late in the afternoon, Rosa found herself in the sunroom, dusting the ornate shelves that lined the walls. The room, bathed in golden light, was one of her favorite spaces in the mansion, a rare blend of elegance and warmth. As she worked, the door creaked open, and Vivian stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor. "Rosa," Vivian said, her tone quieter than usual. "Do you have a moment?" Rosa set down the dustcloth, turning to face her. "Of course, Mrs. Sinclair." Vivian gestured toward the small table by the window, where two chairs sat invitingly. "Sit with me." Rosa nodded, following her to the table. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside. Vivian's usual commanding presence seemed tempered, her posture less rigid, her expression introspective. "I've been thinking about this morning," Vivian began, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation, "about what Ethan said." Rosa waited, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She knew better than to interrupt when Vivian was in this reflective mood. "He's right," Vivian admitted, her gaze fixed on the table. "I've spent so much time trying to control everything, our image, their lives, even my own feelings, and in doing so I pushed them away." Rosa's voice was gentle but firm. "Acknowledging that is the first step." Vivian looked up, her eyes searching Rosa's face. "But is it enough? How do I undo years of mistakes?" "You don't undo them," Rosa said simply. "You build on them. You show them, one day at a time, that you're willing to change." Vivian exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "That sounds so daunting." "Change always is," Rosa said with a faint smile. "But it's worth it." Vivian nodded slowly, her expression softening. "You've become an important part of this family, Rosa, more than I think you realize." Rosa felt a flicker of warmth at Vivian's words, but kept her response measured. "Thank you. I care about this family, and I want to see it heal." Vivian studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You might be the glue holding us together." Before Rosa could respond, the door opened again, and Ethan stepped inside. His hands shoved into his pockets, he hesitated when he saw them sitting together but didn't retreat. "Am I interrupting?" Ethan asked, his tone neutral but his eyes wary. "Not at all," Vivian said, her voice soft. "Come, sit with us." Ethan raised an eyebrow but obliged, pulling out a chair and slumping into it. He glanced at Rosa, his expression softening slightly. "Rosa's here. That's a good sign." Vivian's lips twitched into a faint smile, though she didn't comment. Instead, she turned to Ethan, her voice quieter than Rosa had ever heard it. "I want to apologize, Ethan, for everything. For not being the mother you needed me to be." Ethan stiffened, his gaze darting to Rosa as if seeking reassurance. Rosa gave him a small nod, silently encouraging him to listen. Vivian continued, her tone earnest. "I know I've made it hard for you to trust me, and I don't blame you for being angry, but I want to try to be better for you and Grace." Ethan sat in silence, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "It's not going to be easy, Mom. You can't just say the right things and expect us to forget everything." "I know," Vivian said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, "but I'm willing to put in the work. I just hope you'll give me the chance." Rosa watched as Ethan's expression softened, the anger in his eyes giving way to something more vulnerable. He let out a sigh, leaning back in his chair. "I guess it's a start." Vivian's shoulders relaxed slightly, a hint of relief crossing her face. "That's all I'm asking for." Ethan glanced at Rosa again, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You had something to do with this, didn't you?" Rosa shook her head, her voice light. "I just reminded your mother of what she already knew deep down." Vivian smiled at that, a genuine warmth in her expression. "And I'm grateful for it." As the three of them sat together, a tentative but undeniable shift seemed to settle over the room. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning, fragile, yet full of possibility. Rosa felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her presence had helped guide them toward this moment. Later, as Rosa returned to her tasks, she reflected on the day's events. The Sinclairs still had a long way to go, but for the first time, Rosa felt that they were truly walking the path together. And for her, that made all the difference. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Sinclair mansion, casting a warm, golden glow across the polished floors. Rosa Morales was in the parlor, arranging a vase of fresh lilies. She had learned over the years that the simple act of arranging flowers could be soothing, even amid the complexities of life in the Sinclair household. Yet, her thoughts were not entirely calm. The morning's fragile conversation between Vivian and Ethan played in her mind, a cautious but hopeful melody. The soft creak of the door drew Rosa's attention. Grace entered, her steps deliberate, her expression unreadable. She wore a tailored blazer and jeans, her polished exterior revealing little of the emotions she often kept hidden. "Rosa," Grace said, her voice casual but carrying an undercurrent of purpose. "Do you have a moment?" Rosa set the vase down gently, turning to face her. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Grace gestured toward the settee by the window, and Rosa followed her lead, sitting across from her. For a moment, Grace stared out at the garden, her fingers lightly tracing the armrest. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom," Grace began, her voice measured, "about everything she said at breakfast." Rosa tilted her head slightly, waiting for Grace to continue. "I want to believe her," Grace said, finally turning her gaze to Rosa. "But I can't help wondering, what if it doesn't last? What if she goes back to being her?" Rosa folded her hands in her lap, her voice calm but firm. "Change isn't linear, Grace. There will be setbacks. But the fact that she's trying means something." Grace sighed, leaning back against the cushions. "It's just, she's always been so focused on appearances, on perfection. It's hard to imagine her letting that go." "She may never completely let it go," Rosa admitted. "But even small changes can make a big difference. And those changes can ripple outward." Grace studied Rosa, her expression softening. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I do," Rosa said with quiet conviction. "I've seen it happen, even in the hardest of circumstances." Grace nodded slowly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You have this way of making everything seem possible. It's infuriating." Rosa laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm just speaking from experience." Grace stood, smoothing the fabric of her blazer. "Well, keep doing it. We need someone like you around here." As Grace left the room, Rosa felt a quiet satisfaction. The threads of connection within the Sinclair family were growing stronger, even if they were still fragile. For the first time, Rosa felt that Grace was beginning to let go of her skepticism and allow herself to hope. Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual rhythm, Rosa was tidying the library when Vivian entered. She carried a glass of wine in one hand, her movements uncharacteristically unhurried. Rosa straightened, her hands stilling as she watched Vivian approach. "Rosa," Vivian said, her tone softer than usual. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Mrs. Sinclair," Rosa replied, setting the book she was holding onto the shelf. Vivian gestured toward one of the armchairs, taking the seat across from it. Rosa hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her posture attentive but relaxed. "I wanted to thank you," Vivian began, her voice quiet, "for what you said earlier, for being here." Rosa nodded, her expression kind but composed. "It's my job, Mrs. Sinclair." Vivian shook her head slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips. "No, it's more than that. You've done more for this family than I ever expected or deserved." Rosa remained silent, sensing that Vivian had more to say. "I spent so much of my life trying to control everything," Vivian continued, her gaze distant. because I thought that if I could control it, I wouldn't get hurt. But in the process, I've hurt the people I care about most. It's not too late to change that, Rosa said gently. You've already started. Vivian's eyes met Rosa's, a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. Do you really believe that? I do, Rosa said firmly, and I think Ethan and Grace do too. They just need time. Vivian exhaled, leaning back in her chair. Time and patience, two things I've never been very good at. Rosa smiled faintly. You're learning. That's what matters. Vivian nodded, her expression softening. You've been more than an employee to this family, Rosa. You've been a guide, a friend. I hope you know how much we appreciate you. Rosa felt a warmth spread through her chest at Vivian's words, but she kept her response humble. Thank you, Mrs. Sinclair. That means a lot. As Vivian left the library, Rosa sat for a moment in the quiet room, her thoughts swirling. The Sinclair family was far from perfect, but they were trying. And in their efforts, Rosa saw the beginnings of something she had rarely witnessed in her time working for families like theirs: genuine growth. That night, as Rosa returned to her small apartment and was greeted by Clara's laughter, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was worth walking. And as Rosa held her daughter close, she knew that the bridges she was helping to build in the Sinclair mansion were not just for them. They were for her, too. A testament to the strength it takes to believe in the possibility of change. The morning sunlight poured into the Sinclair mansion's grand dining room, dappling the long table with warmth. Rosa Morales stood near the sideboard, preparing to replenish the silverware for the day. The house was unusually quiet, an almost fragile stillness lingering in the air. It felt like the calm after a storm, a moment where everything teetered on the edge of possibility. The first sound to break the silence was the rhythmic clicking of Grace's heels as she entered the dining room. She carried a steaming mug of coffee, her other hand clutching her phone, though her attention was elsewhere. Catching sight of Rosa, she offered a small smile, setting her coffee down on the table. "Rosa," Grace began, sliding her phone into her blazer pocket, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Rosa turned toward her, setting the silverware aside. "Of course, Grace." Grace sat in one of the high-backed chairs, her movements unusually deliberate. "I've been thinking about something you said the other day, about giving people the chance to change." Rosa nodded, taking a seat across from her. "What about it?" Grace hesitated, her gaze shifting to the window. "It's hard to believe in someone when they've let you down so many times, but I think you're right. If I don't give Mom a chance now, I'll never know if she's really capable of being different." Rosa leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Trust is a risk, Grace, but it's also a gift. By giving her that chance, you're not just helping her, you're giving yourself the opportunity to heal." Grace nodded slowly, her expression softening. "It's just hard to let go of the past." "It always is," Rosa said gently, "but holding on to it won't change what's already happened. It'll only keep you from moving forward." Grace looked at Rosa, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Rosa admitted, "but that's why it's worth it." Grace exhaled, a small laugh escaping her. "You're annoyingly wise, you know that?" Rosa chuckled softly. "I've been called worse." The lightness in their exchange seemed to ease some of Grace's tension, and Rosa felt a flicker of hope that the Sinclair family's fractures were beginning to mend. The afternoon brought a different kind of interaction. Ethan found Rosa in the library, where she was dusting the shelves. He appeared in the doorway, his usual casual demeanor replaced with something more subdued. "Hey, Rosa," he said, stepping inside. "Got a minute?" Rosa set down her dusting cloth, turning to face him. Always. What's on your mind? Ethan hesitated, leaning against the desk. It's about Mom. I've been trying to figure out if I can trust her, if this change she's trying to make is real. Rosa nodded, her gaze steady. That's understandable. Trust takes time, Ethan. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a frustrated sigh. I want to believe her. I really do. But it's hard to forget all the time she put her image above us. Rosa approached him, her voice soft but firm. The past is part of who we are, but it doesn't have to define what comes next. If she's willing to try, maybe you can meet her halfway. Ethan's shoulders slumped slightly, his expression conflicted. I just don't want to get hurt again. I understand, Rosa said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. But sometimes, taking that risk is the only way to move forward, and you're stronger than you think. Ethan offered a faint smile, his voice quiet. I don't know how you do it, Rosa. Stay so calm, so hopeful. Rosa smiled gently. I've had practice, and I've learned that hope is the first step to finding something better. Ethan nodded, his expression softening. Thanks, Rosa. You always know what to say. As the evening approached, Vivian requested Rosa's presence in the sunroom. The space, filled with warm amber light, had become a frequent setting for their conversations. Vivian sat near the window, a glass of wine in her hand, her posture more relaxed than usual. Rosa, Vivian said as she entered, sit with me. Rosa nodded, taking the chair across from her. Of course, Mrs. Sinclair. Vivian took a sip of her wine, her gaze thoughtful. I spoke with Ethan earlier, and Grace. They're hesitant, but they're listening. That's a good sign, Rosa said gently. It means they're willing to try. Vivian's lips curved into a faint smile. You've had a hand in that, you know. They trust you. They trust me because I've been honest with them, Rosa said, and they're learning to be honest with themselves. Vivian nodded, her expression softening. You've done more for this family than I ever thought possible, Rosa. And I don't just mean your work here. You've given us something we didn't know we needed. Rosa felt a warmth spread through her chest, but kept her response measured. I'm just doing my best, Mrs. Sinclair. Vivian leaned back, her gaze steady on Rosa. Your best has been more than enough. As Rosa left the sunroom, she carried with her a sense of quiet accomplishment. The cracks in the Sinclair family's foundation were still there, but the healing process had begun. Rosa knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that progress, no matter how small, was worth celebrating. And as she returned to her quarters for the evening, Rosa allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing she had helped guide the family toward a better future. The following morning in the Sinclair mansion began with an uncharacteristic ease. The tension that usually hung in the air seemed to have softened, replaced by a tentative calm. Rosa Morales noticed the subtle shift as she prepared for the day, her steps lighter as she moved through the sunlit corridors. Though the changes were fragile, they were real, a sign that the family was beginning to find its footing. Rosa was in the kitchen, helping Monica arrange the breakfast trays, when Ethan entered. He was dressed casually, his tie missing as usual, but there was a sense of purpose in his stride. Morning, Rosa, he greeted, grabbing an apple from the counter. Got a second? Rosa nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. Of course. What's on your mind? Ethan leaned against the counter, taking a bite of the apple before speaking. I talked to Mom again last night. She seemed different, like she was actually listening. That's a good thing, Rosa said, her tone encouraging. How did it feel? Ethan hesitated, his brow furrowing. It felt weird, like I didn't know how to respond. She's never been like that before. Change is uncomfortable, Rosa said gently. But it sounds like she's trying to meet you halfway. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression softening. Yeah, I guess. It's just hard to shake the feeling that it's temporary. Rosa placed a comforting hand on his arm. Give it time, Ethan. Trust doesn't happen all at once. It's built in moments like these. Ethan smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. You're good at this. You know that. Talking people down from their ledges. Rosa chuckled softly. It's a skill I've had to learn. Ethan nodded, his smile widening slightly before he turned to leave. Thanks, Rosa, for everything. As he walked out, Rosa felt a flicker of pride. Ethan was starting to open up, his walls slowly coming down. It was a small victory, but one that gave her hope for the family's future. Later that afternoon, Rosa found Grace in the study, poring over documents spread across the large mahogany desk. Her blazer was draped over the back of her chair, and her expression was one of focused determination. "Grace," Rosa said softly, stepping into the room, "do you need anything?" Grace looked up, her features softening when she saw Rosa. "Actually, yes. Sit with me for a minute." Rosa complied, taking the seat across from her. Grace leaned back, running a hand through her neatly styled hair. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Grace began. "About letting go of the past and giving Mom a chance." Rosa waited, sensing that Grace was working through her thoughts. "It's not easy," Grace admitted, her voice quieter. "But I'm starting to see that holding on to my resentment isn't helping anyone, least of all me." Rosa nodded, her tone gentle. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, Grace. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what's already happened." Grace sighed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You always know how to make things sound so manageable." "It's not easy," Rosa said honestly, "but it's worth it." Grace nodded, her expression contemplative. "I think I'm ready to try, for Ethan, for myself, and maybe even for her." Rosa's heart swelled with pride at Grace's words. "That's all anyone can ask." Grace leaned forward, her smile growing. "You know, if you ever get tired of working for us, you could probably make a fortune as a therapist." Rosa laughed softly, shaking her head. "I think I'll stick to what I know." Grace's laughter joined hers, the sound light and genuine. Rosa felt the bond between them strengthen in that moment, a reminder that even small connections could lead to significant change. As the evening settled over the mansion, Rosa found herself summoned to Vivian's office. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, its usual air of authority softened by the golden light. Vivian sat behind her desk, her posture relaxed, but her expression thoughtful. "Rosa," Vivian said as she entered, "come in." Rosa closed the door behind her, taking the seat Vivian gestured toward. "I've been thinking about how far we've come," Vivian began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And how much of that is because of you?" Rosa shook her head slightly. "This family's progress is because of the work you've all been willing to do. I've just been here to support you." Vivian smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "You're too modest, Rosa. You've done more for us than I think you realize." Rosa's chest tightened at the sincerity in Vivian's tone, but she kept her response measured. "I care about this family, Mrs. Sinclair. That's why I've done what I can." Vivian nodded, her expression contemplative. "And we care about you, Rosa. You've become a part of this family, whether you intended to or not." Rosa felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she remained humble. "Thank you, Mrs. Sinclair. That means a lot." As Rosa left the office, her thoughts were a mixture of pride and gratitude. The Sinclair family's journey was far from over, but they were making progress, each of them taking tentative steps toward healing and connection. And as Rosa walked through the quiet halls, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a witness to their transformation, she was a part of it, and in that realization, she found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The Sinclair mansion stirred to life slowly that morning, the first rays of light creeping over the hills and flooding the grand windows with warmth. Rosa Morales arrived early in the kitchen, her hands working with practiced precision to help Monica prepare breakfast. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft sizzle of bacon in the pan. The quiet hum of the house felt comforting, but Rosa sensed the undercurrents of change rippling through the walls. The stillness was broken when Ethan walked in, his usual casual air softened by a hint of uncertainty. He reached for a mug and poured himself coffee, leaning against the counter as he took a sip. "Morning, Rosa," he greeted, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Good morning, Ethan," Rosa replied, her smile warm. "You're up early," he shrugged, cradling his mug in both hands. "Couldn't sleep. A lot on my mind." Rosa paused her work, turning to face him fully. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to his coffee. "It's Mom. She's been trying so hard lately, and I want to believe her, but every time I start to let my guard down, I remember all the times she let us down before." Rosa stepped closer, her voice calm and steady. "Trust isn't easy, Ethan, especially when it's been broken. But the fact that you're even considering it means there's still hope." Ethan nodded slowly, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I guess I just don't know how to move past it." Rosa placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You take it one step at a time. Focus on the little things she's doing now, not the mistakes of the past." He glanced up at her, his smile faint but genuine. "How do you always know the right thing to say?" Rosa chuckled softly. "Years of practice and a lot of listening." Ethan's smile widened, and for a moment the heaviness lifted. He straightened, taking another sip of his coffee. "Thanks, Rosa. You're like the glue holding this family together." "I'm just here to remind you of what you're all capable of," Rosa said with a smile. "You're doing the hard work yourselves." Ethan nodded, his expression contemplative. "Maybe, but we couldn't do it without you." Later that day, Rosa found Grace in the library, her tablet and notebook spread out on the desk. She appeared focused, her brow furrowed as she scrolled through a document. Rosa knocked lightly on the doorframe, drawing Grace's attention. "Am I interrupting?" Rosa asked. Grace shook her head, setting her pen down. "Not at all. I could use the distraction." Rosa stepped inside, glancing at the mess of papers on the desk. "Looks like you're working hard," Grace sighed, leaning back in her chair, "just trying to keep up with everything. Work, family, Mom." "How's that going?" Rosa asked gently. Grace hesitated, her gaze dropping to the desk. "It's complicated. She's trying, and I see that, but it's hard to let go of all the time she wasn't there." "That's understandable," Rosa said, taking a seat across from her. "But it sounds like you're starting to see her efforts." Grace nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I am, and I want to believe in her. I just don't know if I'm ready to fully forgive her yet." "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Grace," Rosa said. "It's about choosing to move forward despite the pain, and that takes time." Grace looked at Rosa, her expression softening. "You always make it sound so manageable." "It's not," Rosa admitted. "But that's what makes it meaningful." Grace smiled faintly, leaning forward. "You've been such a rock for us, Rosa. I don't know how you do it." "I just remind myself why I'm here," Rosa said simply. "And I believe in the people I'm helping." Grace nodded, her smile growing. "We're lucky to have you." As evening settled over the mansion, Vivian requested a family meeting in the living room. Rosa stayed nearby, sensing the importance of the gathering, but choosing to give them space. She tidied the adjoining parlor, her ears catching fragments of the conversation drifting through the door. "I know I've made mistakes," Vivian's voice carried, steady but tinged with vulnerability. "And I don't expect forgiveness overnight. But I'm committed to being better, for myself and for both of you." Grace's response was softer, but Rosa could hear the sincerity in her tone. "We've seen that, Mom, and we're willing to try," Ethan chimed in, his voice quieter but resolute. "Yeah, one step at a time, right?" Vivian's reply was almost too soft to hear, but the gratitude in her voice was unmistakable. "Thank you." Rosa smiled to herself, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. The Sinclair family was far from perfect, but they were beginning to find their way. It was in moments like these that Rosa saw the true strength of the bonds they were rebuilding. When the family emerged from the living room, their expressions were lighter, their postures less tense. Vivian paused when she saw Rosa, her lips curving into a small but genuine smile. "Rosa," Vivian said, her tone warm, "thank you for everything." Rosa inclined her head, her own smile gentle. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Sinclair." As Rosa returned to her quarters that night, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The cracks in the Sinclair family's foundation were beginning to heal, their fragile connections growing stronger with each passing day. And though the road ahead would still hold challenges, Rosa knew they were no longer walking it alone. For the first time, Rosa allowed herself to believe that not only had she helped transform the Sinclairs' lives, but she had also found a place of belonging and purpose in their journey. And that, she realized, was the greatest reward of all. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.